Shall we begin? So, welcome back everyone, and we begin now the second panel of this workshop in which we dive into the experiences of racial violence in the Americas, especially in the United States, Brazil, and Cuba. We begin with the presentation of Michael Pfeiffer. He has 20 minutes or more, like to present his paper. You all had the opportunity of reading his paper in advance. Then I will present my research focused on Brazil, Cuba, and the United States. And then we have the comments of Aline Hell, and finally, the floor is open for discussion. Michael, please take the lead.
Okay, well, thank you, Marcelo, for the invitation and the opportunity to be part of this very interesting workshop. So this paper is sort of a revisiting of a chapter I wrote about maybe 12 years ago for a book on the prehistory, as it were, of American lynching, and the book is called Roots of Rough Justice: Origins of American Lynching. And the book does a number of things, but it tries to trace the development of this particular kind of collective violence. And you may or may not know, but the term the term lynching apparently is American in origin. Apparently it does come from the late 18th century, and it was originally associated with extralegal violence perpetrated during the Revolutionary War in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. And there was a Colonel Charles Lynch who led a band of patriots, as they were called in that conflict, who punished Tories. So these are people who supported American independence, and they're summarily punishing people who supported Britain. And then this term lynch law kind of entered the lexicon. And then 1830s is another important transformation where, because of the rise of the penny press and newspapers became much more widely circulated, we had a reporting of a hanging of 5 gamblers in Vicksburg, Mississippi, which perhaps because of maybe just an error by the printer, somehow how this got sort of put down on paper. This was called a lynching, and prior to that time, the term lynching it connoted violence that typically was non-lethal, and then after this point, the term becomes associated with particularly with hanging, but certainly with lethal violence. But the kind of the understanding of the term, it's very dynamic. It shifts over time, and then what eventually happens is, as probably all of you are familiar with, it becomes associated particularly with racial violence and with racial punishment. And one of the things that I'm doing in this chapter is trying to understand how this developed with regard to the extralegal collective killing of enslaved persons, and how that developed in the American South. Some other things are analyzed in the chapter as well, and I think they connect in interesting ways with, for example, the next panel. So I do look a bit, both in that chapter and elsewhere, at the lynching of Indigenous persons in the United States, and that's a very neglected topic, actually. And I look also at the lynching of Latinos, Hispanics, particularly persons of Mexican descent, but also, if we're looking at the context of the California gold rush, we're looking also at other Latin Americans who are coming up and participating in that event, including Chileans and Peruvians. So I'm looking at this chapter at the development of various kinds of racial lynching as it had come to be known by the 1830s, and then the term in the sort of the American lexicon, the American mind, it becomes very associated with white supremacy, and particularly the extra-legal execution of African Americans. And I argue that this is something that it actually it starts during enslavement. It starts during slavery. If we look at the scholarship on lynching, I mean, for particular reasons, it very much concentrates on the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And it concentrates in that way for very good reasons, because as you probably know, there was a tremendous surge of lynching directed against African Americans beginning in the early 1890s that continued through the 1910s or so, and then persisted at a lower level really into the 1940s. And then after that, it sort of transforms into something else. And for example, the lynching of Emmett Till, it kind of it follows that kind of a further transformation of the violence, where it really goes underground, and it becomes very secretive. Whereas, as you may know, in say the 1890s or the first decade of the 20th century, often lynch mobs in the South were very, very large, and thousands of people participated, and these were highly spectacular events in terms of being spectacles. So much of the scholarship on lynching, American lynching, has to do with the Jim Crow era, and much of it actually uses sources that were generated by the anti-lynching movement that began, of course, as you probably know, with Ida B. Wells, the great anti-lynching activist, African-American journalist and activist and scholar. And then in succeeding decades, the work of particularly of the NAACP and Tuskegee Institute also was very important in chronicling lynchings. So scholars have used the data, or kind of the sources that were generated by the anti-lynching movement of the late 19th, early 20th centuries, and that has really driven a lot of the scholarship. So these earlier episodes of racial violence, including during slavery, they haven't really been pursued, and they haven't really been considered very, very thoroughly. There's another important period as well, if we look at the history of racial lynching in the US, and actually what the Equal Justice Institute calls racial terror lynchings. And this has to do with the period of Reconstruction that followed the emancipation of enslaved persons. And so the period from 1865 through 1877 or so saw also a vast wave of homicidal collective violence directed against the freed people. And that is another sort of era in American lynching history that has not really been adequately analyzed, although there is some very important work that's come out in recent years, including the work of Kadada Williams, who just published a book on this, actually a second book on this. And so we have sort of these different eras of racial terror lynching, as it were. So I'm talking here in this paper about the originating era in some respects, kind of when this first develops. And I think it's extremely important, and I think this practice of lynching enslaved persons that developed in the say 30 years before the American Civil War. I think this lays a template for what would follow during the Reconstruction era, and we don't even really have good data in terms of the number of African Americans who were killed during the Reconstruction period by mobs. Some of that violence was done by more organized kinds of groups, such as the Ku Klux Klan, but some of the violence was just simply done kind of on an individual basis that was not highly organized. So I think the lynching of enslaved persons lays a precursor for what occurs in the succeeding decades after slavery is legally over with, and Southern whites are trying to find ways to retain racial hierarchy, they're trying to find ways to continue to implement a severe racial control, and they remember this practice that developed during slavery, and so that's sort of the context with what I'm trying to do in this paper, is to sort of recover this practice of the lynching of enslaved persons in the 30 years or so before the Civil War. So I searched somewhat extensively, but not comprehensively, in Southern and Northern newspapers. And in some ways, these are good sources for this, and in other ways they're not good sources. And of course, these are very biased sources. I mean, certainly we have black newspapers from the 19th century, and they took a great interest in these events, and those are very important sources. But often these are white newspapers, and they fully embody the biases of Southern whites or Northern whites. And also, often newspapers didn't really report these events, or if they did so very kind of reticently and incompletely. And so, looking at things like personal correspondence, where maybe a northern traveler was traveling through the South, and like Frederick Law Olmsted, his very famous journals where he was traveling through the South. These can be better sources for recovering this violence, and also of course the accounts of the enslaved persons themselves. And there are some descriptions in, for example, the WPA slave narratives, which of course are a kind of a complex source to use, and are, and of course it's much later, it's 1930s. These are accounts that are collected, and they're people speaking to white interviewers, and so anyway, these are complex sources, but the slave narratives are a way at getting at this violence, and of course also slave narratives that were composed during the period of enslavement itself, during the slavery era, also are a way to get at this. But anyway, looking at a variety of sources, I found the lynching of 56 blacks, mainly enslaved persons, but also some free blacks, in the years 1824 to 1862, and this is a very severe undercount by any measure, because again, my research was not comprehensive. And as I mentioned in the paper, Kelly Houston Jones is a scholar who has started to research this, and she has already found at least 80 cases. And so I suspect, again, this is just scratching the surface in terms of what actually occurred in the antebellum era. And I think it's clear that Southern whites and Northern whites were also familiar with this practice, and certainly would have been familiar with it as the Civil War ended. So I just want to describe some of the context in which this occurred, and it has kind of the roots of this violence have a lot to do with the imperfections, as it were, of slavery in terms of trying to totalize white control over African Americans. This has a lot to do, in my view, with legal change and shifts that were developing in terms of criminal justice in the South and across the United States during these years. This has to do with divisions among Southern whites, divisions between slaveholding whites and non-slaveholding whites, and sort of their different understandings of how to implement racial hierarchy. And there also are important regional differences within the South. And so it seems as though the lynching of enslaved persons was more predominant in the western states. And for example, Missouri and Texas. This is sort of the western boundary of slavery during these years. And so those states had the most cases, and it seems like this was related to the fact that slaveholders didn't have maybe the same kind of control of the polity there, and the laws were less perfectly realized in terms of trying to control African Americans. And also, extremely importantly, this has to do with continual African American contestation of enslavement and white supremacy, and then a very, very harsh white response, trying to send an intimidating message with regard to the consequences of resisting and defying white supremacy. So I don't want to go much past my allotted time here, but just a few things that I think are important here are that among the lynchers, we have a debate over the method of execution. And so about half of the lynch mobs that I looked at chose to hang their victim, and half chose to immolate their victim, to burn their victim to death. And this is rooted in changes in the criminal justice system and statutory law during these years. And burning at the stake had been a punishment reserved for slaves and also for wives who killed their husbands in the early modern world. And that was done away with largely in the reforms during the revolutionary period, the independence period, as Marcelo calls it in his work. It was, however, retained in South Carolina. It was still on the books in South Carolina for enslaved persons, that this could be used as a punishment. And some of these lynch mobs, they actually engaged in a debate just before the lynching. And sometimes they even voted as to which punishment to use. So in many of these southern states, hanging was the only legal punishment available. And yet some of these lynch mobs instead chose to burn their victims to death. So this is certainly related to certain racialized notions of punishment. Other aspects of this that I think are significant have to do with kind of a resistance by Southern whites of a growing tendency towards bringing enslaved persons into the same courts as whites, although it's never, of course, it was never even remotely equal. but there is a tendency to sort of bring them within the same court system as opposed to having special courts for enslaved persons. And there's a frustration that whites exhibited with this tendency towards due process, which was never a real due process, never a meaningful due process, but gestures towards legal fairness. And some of that has to do with slaveholders sort of protecting their chattel, protecting their property investment, and trying to shield their property investment within the legal process. And then you have non-slaveholding whites reacting and saying, no, we need a harsher punishment for these enslaved persons. And as you probably know, non-slaveholding whites joined with slaveholding whites in the slave patrol. And so the non-slaveholding whites had a role, an important role, in terms of policing enslaved persons, but there nonetheless existed tensions in terms of the understandings of non-slaveholding whites versus slaveholding whites with regard to handling accusations of enslaved persons' deviancy. Sometimes enslaved women were lynched as well. And I think this connects interestingly with our first paper with regard to the depiction of African American women and enslaved women. So certainly this practice was gendered, and this is also true of the African American men who were lynched in terms of the understanding of them. It seems as though a lot of this had to do with the westward migration of slavery and how enslaved persons were resisting this, and of course their families were being uprooted, and then they're being forcibly moved out west to, say, Texas or Louisiana, separated from their communities, separated from their families, and they're resisting this in various ways, and then whites are punishing them for that resistance. So that's an important context for this practice of the lynching of enslaved persons as it developed. And I think this is very much about a debate among whites with regard to what I call a jurisprudence of racial mastery in a white republic. And so this has to do with how this is playing out with regard to their understanding of criminal justice and punishment. And of course, the slaveholder, as Marcelo writes about in his paper, the slaveholder had legal color to lethally punish an enslaved person. But what is happening in these cases is that the larger white community is claiming that authority as well. So this is very much about a white republic and how it's working out its notions of how racial mastery, how white supremacy might best be implemented. So I'm not certain that that scholars have really taken this up. That this has really kind of entered the consciousness of lynching studies, as it were. But I think it's a very important template precursor for what follows it, and it is a crucial legacy of American slavery. And I think it certainly supports Marcelo's contention in his paper that there was a hegemonic source of power and legitimacy in each regime of racial violence, that being the white race in the democratic American South. So, thank you. Do you need the microphone?
I was definitely going to forget. I'm glad I am the type of person who presents all of my problems to everyone in advance. Thank you. Well, everyone, thank you for the opportunity of sharing my work with you. Of course, you can realize by now how selfish I was building this workshop and this panel, because right now Michael Pfeiffer is presenting his analysis of lynching. Aline Helg is going to be commenting on these papers, and she's the expert on racial violence in Cuba. And thus, I'm the one trying to build all of us into a conversation today. I'd like to begin with kind of an improvised introduction that might bring our works together in this discussion. At the dawn of the 20th century, lynching in the United States became the main paradigm of racial violence in the Americas. The disenfranchisement of African America, the segregation by law, mob justice, characterized the regime of racial terror in the American South during the age of Jim Crow. As we see, not only in the aftermath of slavery, it begins long before that, but it becomes something else in the late 19th century, early 20th century. In the meantime, Afro-Cubans conquered political rights and organized the first Black political party on the continent after participating of the effort to achieve independence of their island. Yet, the Cuban state banned this organization and the army massacred thousands of activists who resisted. This is the massacre of 1912 that Aline Helg teaches us about. These modern spectacles of racial violence encouraged Brazilian conservative statements and scholars to deny the existence of racism in their country and claim that their ancestors had founded a racial paradise in South America. Afro-Brazilians knew better. After a few episodes of racial lynching at the turn of the 19th century, mob violence, it was a Brazilian phenomenon for a while, it declined. But state repression against people of color was as brutal in Brazil as it was in Cuba, and it still is. In fact, Afro-Brazilians suffered under an anonymous regimes of race and violence at the early age of color blindness. We can discuss this idea of early age of color blindness later. And this is my question. Why did the most enduring slave nations in the Atlantic world produce such different outcomes in the aftermath of emancipation? I believe my investigation offers an answer, not a definitive answer, definitely, but at least by bringing all of these experiences together, I think it pushes all of us to think about this phenomenon with a transnational perspective. My presentation is titled Slavery, Criminal Law, and Regimes of Racial Violence in the Americas, Brazil, Cuba, and the United States between 1776 and 1848. This presentation is inspired by the first and second chapters of my book project. The book is provisionally titled The Politics of Racial Violence in the Americas, Slavery, Citizenship, and Criminal Law in Brazil, Cuba, and the United States between 1776 and 1912. What I present today is essentially part one of my book project, chapters 1 and especially chapter 2. Here I analyze slave resistance, Black resistance, and the intersection between slavery, race, and citizenship in the making of criminal justice systems and regimes of violence in the early 19th century Atlantic world. My presentation is organized in 4 sections. There's a short introduction, 4 sections, and a conclusion section. Everything inspired by the paper I shared with you, although this is a more simplified version of what you had the opportunity of reading. So let's begin with this introduction I mentioned. I'm sorry for being a little too organized when I'm speaking in English. I'm usually like this because I don't improvise as well as I improvise in Portuguese. I love being a Brazilian teacher, and it's a nightmare to do so in the US. So I begin by talking about the Age of Revolution and a new age of slavery and race in the Americas. The Age of Revolution was a turning point in the history of the Atlantic slavery. It initiated a first age of abolition in the Americas and at the same time a new age for bondage in the United States, Cuba, and Brazil. Haitians moved beyond any previous experience of black resistance in the Americas and set the precedent of an abolitionist black revolution. This historical event had a major impact all over the continent. Free blacks from Salvador to Havana radicalized their struggle for equality. Enslaved men and women from the Mississippi Valley to the Recôncavo Baiano now foresaw freedom as their right to vindicate. However, none of these rebellions achieved what the Haitian revolutionaries did. After all, they were not the only ones who learned from Saint-Domingue. Planters benefited from the economic collapse of that French colony and expanded new agricultural frontiers in Cuba, Brazil, and the American South. They were aware of the risk, but they turned the Haitian paradigm into the counter-example of their plantation societies and repressed anyone who tried to rehearse a new Haiti on their lands. At a key moment in their countries, this new generation of slaveholders and their political representatives influenced the making of constitutional regimes and their state repressive institutions. As I argue, at the turn of the 19th century, the greatest cycle of slave resistance in the Atlantic world contributed dialectically to the making of the strongest slaveholding classes in the Americas. This brings us to the content of chapter 1 of my book project. Here I talk like slavery, race, and citizenship in the age of Atlantic revolutions. But I'm talking essentially about constitutions, citizenship qualification, and the making or remaking of distinct racial regimes in the Americas. The constitutions of Brazil, Spain, and the United States created political regimes that overrepresented slaveholding elites and made citizenship a privilege of class and race. However, each nation did it in their own way. The United States were a federal republic founded on racial segregation. Democracy became a white privilege and free blacks were sub-citizens. In turn, Brazil was a centralized monarchy in which all free and freed people born in the national territory were citizens. Nonetheless, the Constitution established unspoken racial degrees of citizenship, preserving hierarchies between whites, browns, and blacks. A similar pattern characterized Cuban society in the early 19th century. And yet, local planters and the representatives in Spain decided to follow the example of the United States. They restricted rights of free people of color and reinforced racial barriers through the law. Moreover, the Cuban elite abdicated from political rights and submitted to Spanish colonialism to preserve slavery and racial supremacy on their island. These constitutions and citizenship qualifications contributed not only to the preservation of slavery, but to the making and remaking of distinct racial regimes in the Americas. But there was a backlash. By organizing race in the society in different ways, this also established the condition from different politics of black resistance in each society. Alliances between free and enslaved people of color was much more frequent in Cuba due to this racial policy, while it was not as frequent in Brazil, where all of these degrees of race were efficient, segregating people of African descent into different social strata and making it difficult for them to ally against racial oppression. The United States was a different experience, but we are all aware of what that means. What I want to talk about, and this is the core of this presentation, I want to talk about the intersection between slavery, race, and criminal law in Brazil, Cuba, and the American South. I'll be honest, the beginning of the presentation is very boring even for me. I like this topic, but it is. But I need to talk about the specificity of each legal regime so that I can understand why this criminal justice system, all of them targeting people of African descent as domestic enemies, but why they were so different in each society and why they created a condition for distinct regimes of violence in each society. The constitutions had become a milestone of liberalism at the turn of the 19th century. They established the sacredness of individual rights, the sovereignty of the people through suffrage, and the principle of the rule of law. Just as important as any of those principles was legal control over state violence. The penal reform movement defended the reform of criminal law to establish rational legal procedure, criminal codes of law, and humane regimes of punishment. It was the birth of modern criminal justice systems and the penitentiary. However, how could there be a liberal criminal justice system in a slave country? I begin with the American answer. The Bill of Rights of 1789 established the principle for the reform of the judiciary in the United States. The amendments to the Constitution regulated the due process of law, the right of criminal defendants to trial by the jury, and prohibited cruel and unusual punishment. These principles should guide the reform of legal and judicial institutions throughout the country. However, due to the Federalist principle, each state assembly was responsible for reforming its own criminal justice system. Therefore, Southern states created a dual legal regime. In court, every American citizen was protected by their constitutional rights and common law precedents, and yet, not all inhabitants in the American South enjoyed citizenship. Enslaved and free people of color were submitted to local slave codes, black codes, and special laws that established specific legal procedures and corporal penalties, a parallel system of justice. Now, the Spanish criminal law, especially in Cuba. In 1811, the Cortes of Cádiz abolished the Inquisition and torture, and the Cádiz Constitution of 1812 prohibited torment in the Spanish territories. In the following decades, the criminal codes of 1822 and 1848 established the principles of a modern criminal justice system in the Spanish Empire, according to the penal reform movement. Yet, this legislation was never applied to the colonial military regime in Cuba. For most of the 19th century, Cuba remained under the rule of Spanish colonial laws. Moreover, the Spanish monarchy determined the creation of military commissions to try individuals accused of political crimes, and the capital generals of Cuba decided to include serious crimes committed by enslaved people under the jurisdiction of the special courts. Therefore, enslaved defendants never enjoyed constitutional rights and guarantees in Cuba, and neither did free people of color. They were tried and punished by colonial or military courts under the rule of laws inherited from the Spanish old regime. Finally, the Brazilian criminal law. The Criminal Code of 1830 and the Criminal Procedure Code of 1832 created a modern criminal justice system in Brazil and regulated legal forms of punishment according to the penal reform movement. Brazilians innovated by creating one criminal code that applied to free citizens and enslaved people all over the national territory. It regulated specific crimes and penalties for enslaved defendants. Meanwhile, the Criminal Procedure Code only differentiated free and enslaved defendants in a few articles, and it determined that all capital crimes would be submitted to jury trials. Therefore, enslaved defendants who were accused of homicide or insurrection would benefit from due process and legal guarantees. Yet, their fate would be decided by a jury of citizens, many of whom were white enslavers. After a wave of slave rebellions in the mid-1830s, National Congress reformed the criminal legislation and enacted the law of 1835 that established special procedures that violated defendants' rights and accelerated the execution of capital punishment against enslaved convicts who were accused of attacking their masters and overseers. Okay, these are different legal systems, different criminal justice systems, but what is the purpose of this comparative analysis? Here I bring what I believe is one of the important conclusions of this research. By the end of the decade of 1830, the penal reform movement had transformed criminal justice systems in the West. Nowhere did it fulfill the premises of preventing crimes and rehabilitating convicts. As I argue, the prison is a global failure. Yet, the contradiction between penal reform principles and the reality of criminal courts were explicit in the Spanish Caribbean, the American South, and Brazil, where slavery and racism were the backbone of the justice systems. Despite the specificity of each constitutional order, this nation established two regimes of justice. Civil rights and guarantees applied to citizens. Meanwhile, the rest of the population was stigmatized by race and enslavement and submitted to special laws. These legal regimes targeted Africans and their descendants as domestic enemies, subjected to a permanent state of exception under the rule of law. Yes, we are talking about distinct criminal justice system, distinct legal regimes, but in all of them, people of African descent are submitted to special laws, even when it looks like they're being integrated to formal legal justice. Okay. But so far, this is very theoretical. We're analyzing the law, the principles that should be executed. But what was the everyday life of people who lived and died on the plantations entered courtrooms and were punished by law or outside the rule of law. This is the content of chapter 2 of my book project, Economies of Punishment and Regimes of Violence in the Frontiers of Slavery. Here I analyze the experience of people who were enslaved on the three most important agricultural frontiers of slavery in the 19th century Americas. The cotton frontier in the Mississippi Valley, the sugar frontier in Matanzas, western Cuba, and the coffee frontier in southeast Brazil, the Paraíba Valley, the countryside of Rio de Janeiro. These were new agricultural frontiers, regions that were occupied and exploited after, in the turn of the 19th century. And we are talking about people who were victimized by the Atlantic or domestic slave trade and who were submitted to these new legal regimes at a new age of slavery. I'm going to offer like a short interpretation. I won't tell the stories that you can see in my chapter, but a short interpretation of the most important events that took place in each of these plantation societies and how I interpret the experiences of legal violence and extra-legal violence in each one of them, beginning with slave courts and white terror in the Mississippi Valley. Here I analyze the German Coast Rebellion of 1811. This is not in my paper, but it's in my previous chapter, but it works as a representation, and the Panic or Insurrection Scare of 1835. The American Constitution determined that violence was an exclusive attribute of the state, but slave and black codes legalized the slaveholders' right to punish. When enslaved people committed serious offenses, they were tried by slave courts, an improvised assembly of a few freeholders and a justice or two justices of peace, or the jury. This was the case of Mississippi, an exception. And they suffered corporal penalties or capital punishment, usually by hanging. Charles Delonte was the leader of the German Coast Rebellion. After rebels were defeated, he was summarily tried by a slave court and sentenced to death by burning. This was essentially a lynching, but under the rule of the Louisiana Black Code. Although this was a severe punishment, it was legal. However, a few capital crimes like insurrections and the alleged rape of white women violated crucial norms and the racial order and encouraged white communities to dismiss the rule of law. Insurrection scares like the Panic of 1835 were particularly revealing. On some occasions, rural elites conducted extra-legal investigations with the connivance of public authorities and preserved social hierarchies. Planters interrogated and punished conspirators on their plantations, and prestigious citizens and authorities formed vigilance or safety committees to promote extrajudicial trials with some formality. Still, mob justice often prevailed, especially when whites suspected that black conspirators threatened their racial and sexual privileges. This brings us to one of my first conclusions today. The lynch law, and Michael is the expert here, but the lynch law was not only a consequence of racial slavery in the United States, it was also the other face of white democracy in the American South. In the decade of 1830, the expansion of citizenship and political rights to poor whites reinforced racial alliances that contributed to the preservation of the hegemony of the planter class. At the same time, common white men felt encouraged not only to vote or serve as jurors, but also to take justice into their own hands. In conclusion, violence was theoretically a state prerogative and a class privilege, but in practice it was often exercised as a democratic right of the white race in the American South. Now, let's analyze the Brazilian case, the jury and the planters' order in the Paraíba Valley. Here I analyze the Manuel Congo Rebellion of 1838 and the conspiracy of 1848. Insurrection was a capital crime and enslaved defendants were tried by the jury under special laws that reduced their rights in court in Brazil, as I already mentioned. This was the fate of American rebels like Manuel Congo, who faced trial and the gallows in Vassouras, in the Paraíba Valley. These events illuminated the contradictions of the rule of law in the slave society, but alleged conspiracies were even more revealing. In most cases, suspects were subjected to extra-legal violence, but rarely mob justice. In contrast with the American South, racial solidarity among planters and poor whites was not a premise of the slave order in Brazil. The constitution and citizenship regime established social degrees of race and status that discouraged alliances between the free and the enslaved, browns and blacks, Brazilians and Africans. At the same time, criminal law legitimized the enslavers' right to punish, and they rarely shared this prerogative with their free subalterns, most of whom were not even white. The planter class was also politically influent and restricted the intervention of the state in their private dominions. This was especially true during insurrection scares like the Conspiracy of 1848. Enslaved people, when they committed capital crimes, they were tried by the jury and usually sentenced to death by hanging, but alleged conspirators were subjected to a parallel system of justice conducted by planters with the connivance of public authorities. These proceedings revealed that Brazilian planters were more powerful than their peers from the American South and also from Cuba. They often subordinated judicial and police institutions to their interest and preserved the right to punish as a privilege of their class. Finally, I would like to analyze the Cuban case. Military courts and state terror in Matanzas. Here I analyze the Guamacaro Rebellion of 1825 and the Conspiracy of La Escalera of 1844. Nowhere else in the 19th century America slave rebellions were as frequent as in Western Cuba. The same applies to alliances between free and enslaved people of African descent against racial oppression. Under the Spanish colonial regime, free whites and blacks did not enjoy most constitutional rights, but the planter class benefited from a few political privileges and the prerogative of domestic violence. Alongside with colonial authorities, they established a brutal system of surveillance and punishment in the island. Free people of color were subjected to repressive racial policies, while the enslaved lived in a permanent state of war. Consequently, they often united to confront the ruling race. Black rebels were tried by military courts and condemned according to colonial laws. Some were imprisoned or exiled, others were hanged or garroted, and the most subversive faced the firing squads. The spectacles of violence were revealing moments of the Cuban racial regime, and so were insurrection scares. During the Conspiracy of La Escalera, planters conducted extra-legal investigation and executions on their plantations, and there were episodes of collective violence against black suspects. However, the legitimacy of this regime of racial terror depended on the sanction of the state, who was responsible for the torment of thousands of Afro-Cubans during the racial purge of 1844. And this is my conclusion. Cuban planters were not as powerful as their peers from Brazil, and mob justice was not as frequent as it was in the American South. Threatened by the most formidable wave of black resistance, the preservation of the racial order in Cuba relied on a regime of exception based on the prerogative of violence of the Spanish military state. Later during our discussion, I can present these tables in which I compare experiences of insurrections in each society and legal violence as one response. So slave courts and hanging or burning in the American South, the jury in Brazil usually hanging as the main form of punishment, the military courts, the military commission, hanging, garrote, and firing squads in Cuba. But I think it's even more interesting to understand the differences between regimes of extra-legal violence that prevailed during insurrection scares, which are not crimes that have been committed, but only imagined by them. So we're talking about vigilance committees and mob violence in the American South. We are talking about the military commission and state violence in Cuba. In the meantime, in Brazil, planters usually conduct investigation and punish on their plantations. How can we understand these differences? These are all slave societies, these are all racialized societies. I try to offer my interpretation, and this is my conclusion, what I call regimes of racial violence. The preservation of public order in slave societies demanded special laws and legal procedures that compromised the rule of law principle and transformed their justice systems into instruments of the racial order. In these countries, the constitutional prohibition of cruel punishment did not apply to enslaved convicts who were submitted to a variety of corporal penalties. Despite the alleged modernization of criminal law, these modern spectacles of violence revealed reminiscences of the old regime and the prevalence of racialized justice systems. Yet there were important differences between these regimes of legal and extra-legal violence. Each country had their own justice system and technologies of punishment: slave courts, the jury, the military commission, hanging, burning, garrote, firing squads. Furthermore, violence was more explicitly racialized in the United States and Cuba than in Brazil. At the same time, mob violence was more common in North America than in Latin America, and the state was more violent against blacks in Cuba than anywhere else. These differences, and this is my hypothesis, these differences were the consequence of the making of distinct political systems and regimes of citizenship and race. Democracy and white supremacy in the United States encouraged the common white man not only to vote, serve as jurors, but also to conduct parallel forms of justice like lynching. In contrast, the Brazilian monarchy reinforced oligarchical powers, and extra-legal violence was rarely a mob action. The prerogative of violence and justice was essentially a privilege of the planter class that was predominantly white and subordinated free and enslaved people of color. Finally, the presence of a colonial military government reinforced the state prerogative of violence in Cuba. Slaveholders were the main authorities on the plantations, but the preservation of the racial order depended on the Spanish military state. In sum, the right to punish was simultaneously a state prerogative and a privilege of class and race in all three societies. I will repeat this because this is important. The right to punish was simultaneously a state prerogative and a privilege of class and race in all three societies. However, there was a hegemonic source of power and legitimacy under each regime of racial violence: the white race in the democratic American South, the planter class in monarchical Brazil, the Spanish military state in colonial Cuba. The politics of racial violence were distinct, but equally effective in subjecting people of African descent in Brazil, Cuba, and the United States. These constitutional regimes and modern justice system extended legal rights and guarantees for their citizens, while thousands of free and enslaved men and women of color lived in a permanent state of exception. For them, the exception was the norm. Thank you. Now, I would like to offer Professor Aline Helg the opportunity to begin this discussion. I know there is a lot to discuss here,
Yes.
but I hope this is just the beginning of a long conversation.
It's a very difficult task after this two brilliant presentation. And I have a lot of comment that I would be able to give to you separately if you're interested. And my comments are based on the papers rather than the presentation, of course. And I would like just to start with something that I felt is that by reading the paper, in fact, this paper described terrible facts, terrible punishment that were inflicted on people. I mean, this just word, burning alive, whipped to confession and often to death. And I just would like us not to forget what it meant, really, for all that, that violence was inflicted on enslaved and free people of color, that how they endured all that was only part of their life of enduring violence, the fear, the pain, the suffering, and often the death. So just a little thought about for them. And of course, I'm not going to summarize, and I try to have one or two questions for both of you. And the first one is that from reading your papers, I had the impression that violence was particularly intense in the 1930s, the start of what you call this new, the roots of lynching, and a lot of the incidents of that are in your paper, Marcelo. The period of small revolts, slave revolts, conspiracy, race wars, scares. And I would like you to sort of think about a possible common context that could explain the importance of this period. Why is it a period where things change? Is there something on the regional, national context of slavery? I mean, of course, there's slavery and expansion that I think is really very important. A parallel to perhaps an increasing gap between the rich and the poor among the white communities, so tensions that are kind of then diverted toward always the powerless people in the country. Also, it's linked probably to abolitionism race, both in the US North, but also just in the Caribbean. I mean, it's British abolition with so that also might explain intense tensions among the whites in power. And also with the emancipation hopes, also probably for enslaved people and free people of color, more hopes that things will change, and so that it would make the 1830s as kind of special time. And that, I mean, to connect that with this increase of violence and changing laws and all that, it could be also that a kind of greater insecurity among whites and even the enslaved, the enslavers, no? Could mean that for them any kind of sign of protest from the part of enslaved and free people of color would become absolutely threatening, unbearable, and then push for a very violent response. And reading both your papers, I was thinking about what was happening in the British Caribbean previous to abolition, with the revolts in Barbados, the Marara, and Jamaica, how that in fact was a result of both the fear of planters, that their absolute power was threatened, but also increased hope from enslaved people. And how then it's not exactly what we see in the settings that you present, how, because in the British case, violence was so terrifying and in fact made it to London, then that you had this reaction from abolitionists who used that the violence of the slave state and the colonial authorities to sort of then change the make of slavery barbarity, and then they change kind of the image of people of African ancestry, African as the, entre comillas, barbarian that has been built after the Haitian Revolution. So kind of change in the image of who is the barbarian. That's the first question, so if you could say something about this context. The second question has to do with justice and punishment, because the two papers focus principally on execution or lynching. I mean, what Marcelo you call technologies of death. And I'm not going to go into all the different possibilities for that. But at the same time, it seems that more kind of daily form of violence is not really present in the papers. It just is flooding, which is everywhere, every day. If you look at the images of Brazilian slavery, I mean, it's all over the place. Mm-hmm. So what do you do with that in terms of violence? And the other form of punishment, which I think is very important, and you have a point on that, is transportation. Which is, it's kind of social death for the enslaved person, but also banishment for free people of color, which was absolutely the case in the repression of the Escalera conspiracy or alleged conspiracy. So I think that could sort of broaden a little bit the scope of punishment. And on the same kind of level, both your papers talk a lot about the fact that most of the racial violence didn't occur during these major events, the trials and so on, but in the immediate repression of a rebellion, revolts, or alleged conspiracy, in which you describe how it's done by patrols, and the army. And so I think that's something where you could perhaps bring a little bit more, is to develop the role of the army in all that, which, not to make a bad joke, no, but the army is, after all, the armed arm of the nation, or the power of the state. And it's also the army that was employed, and we go to indigenous violence against indigenous people at that time, the same time, in the 1840s, for example, the case of the incredible violence against Maya people in Yucatan, and how, in fact, the army is also this armed arm of the white state. So thank you so much for this paper. And again, I have notes on each of the papers, so if you're interested, we can talk about them another moment.
Thank you, Aline. Michael, you can go first.
Yeah, well, thank you for these very interesting comments. With regard to the 1830s, yeah, I think you pointed out probably some of the reasons why this is such an important period for the rise of this violence and the emergence of this particular form of violence. And yeah, and certainly the expansion of slavery, the westward expansion in the American context, the expansion of democracy for whites, as Marcelo described. I think this is incredibly important. So
Men.
for white men, let's specify. Very important to specify white men. And I think that's really, really crucial for the mob violence that I'm tracing here. And certainly also the increasing defensiveness of whites for various reasons with regard to the rising abolition movement and criticism of the institution of slavery, and so slave-holding whites are becoming very, very defensive in various ways. And this is definitely an important context for this developing. And as you mentioned also, the response of African Americans, whether enslaved or free, to these developments, absolutely critical as well. And so, yeah, I think all of these are factors. I think really important as well for the American context is there is this ideological inheritance from the American Revolution, which of course is several decades before, of popular sovereignty. Mm-hmm. You know, the notion that the people make the law, the government is rooted in the people, and they can reclaim the government even by throwing off law occasionally and behaving lawlessly. And so that was already there in terms of the American sort of legal tradition and the American understanding of violence. But then with this expansion of what it meant to be sort of a white male citizen, that becomes really, really powerful, and it drives this turn to mob violence. I think that's very important. So do you want me to address both questions at once, or maybe we should turn over to Marcelo?
Yeah, maybe.
Okay.
One question after the other.
Okay. I would say that I agree with most of your comments. Like, why the 1830s? We are talking about a period of contradictions. Mm-hmm. This is when the economic expansion of slavery is very powerful. It is connecting slave trade networks. There are very important demographic consequences to that. The number of enslaved people. It's rising in all of this frontiers of slavery, as I mentioned. And at the same time, this is when political dissent over slavery also rises in national parliaments in Brazil, in the United States, and we might even include in Spain, not Cuba, but Spain. So there is this very powerful contradiction between economic forces, like the political expansion of public sphere, abolitionists. We don't talk about abolitionists in Brazil in the 1830s, but there is an anti-slavery agenda taking place in Brazil and Spain at the same time. And of course, this is a moment, like I even think about, like we think about the Age of Revolution as also an age of black revolutions in the Atlantic world. But the same way we think about, there's a first age of revolution, like around the French Revolution, the Haitian revolutions. There's a second age of revolution in the 1830s in Europe, but also in the Atlantic world, and it might include all of these experiences of black resistance. So we are talking about like economic expansion of slavery, demographic impact, slave resistance, black resistance, the rise of abolitionism, and this political dissent over slavery. All of this contributes not only to resistance, but also to increasing racial anxieties in these societies. And then now, to like explain the consequence within criminal justice systems, I'm gonna quote Michael, because he talks about extralegal violence and lynching, not only lynching, but extralegal violence as a consequence of legal change. We're talking about the moment when the penal reform movement is getting powerful in the United States and in the Western world. So new justice systems are being established, but there's a moment of social struggle, racial anxieties. These people are not, like white communities, they're not satisfied with formal justice systems. So they search for alternatives. And eventually the response comes from the judiciary, usually with special laws that reinforce legal punishment, but almost violating the rule of law, and eventually extralegal violence. So this is how I would try to answer, and this is definitely part of this, like the British Caribbean is not in my research, but it's happening at the same time. I just couldn't put it there because then my book would take another 10 years. This is like my answer. You can go to the second one if you want.
Yeah, so the second question with regard to these various forms of punishment and kind of the relationship between everyday punishments versus these more spectacular and more irregular kinds of punishment. Yeah, I think it's really important to understand this as a continuum, and this is it probably falls out of my analysis at times, and it's something that I think is really important to recover. That that there was a continuum of different kinds of violence that enslaved persons were subjected to constantly, and certainly flogging on a daily basis, and all the way over to execution, legal or lynching. And so, for example, in my paper, there's a quote which is actually from the WPA slave narratives. Octavia George, and she describes what she remembers about the mercurial nature of white authority, and she said there were no jails. The white man was the slave's jail. If the whipping didn't settle the crime the Negro committed, the next thing would be to hang him or to burn him at the stake. So I think she really nicely expresses that continuum, and to sort of make these distinctions and only focus on one kind of violence is to maybe to ignore the fact that there was this constant violence that maybe took different forms, but they were all sort of reinforcing the way in which enslavement, white supremacy was enforced by violence.
Like I'm analyzing capital crimes, criminal justice systems, the death penalty, extralegal violence, and what I'm looking at is the minority of cases, because most enslaved people were never taken to court, and most forms of violence took place on the plantation. Like in the second chapter of my book, like the introduction of chapter 2 is actually an introduction to the experience of people who were enslaved in Africa or elsewhere in the Americas, taken to the frontiers of slavery, everyday life on the plantation, punishment connected to labor productivity, but also other forms of punishment that had to do with like this passionate reaction from overseers and planters. I also mentioned, like it's 1 or 2 paragraphs, I talk about violence motivated by gender. But this is the problem. Since I'm focused on the justice system, I'm isolating the most traditional experiences of violence on the plantations. And as I mentioned before, I'm neglecting the experience of Black women who were the main victims of racial violence, but rarely taken to court. Rarely they were the victims of extra-legal violence. A few were, but not as many as men. So there is a problem here. And it's a matter of like the theoretical background, the methodology we choose. I hope someone writes an entire book from the perspective of gender to prove that my hypotheses are partially wrong. And this is good, because that's how we continue debating on this topic. So I try to bring the fact that this is taking place, like the violence is actually much more, like the everyday violence on the plantation is the most important form of violence to understand the societies. But what I'm doing is, by focusing on capital crimes, trial, punishment, legal violence, and extra-legal violence, I'm trying to analyze these special moments because I believe they are revealing of the nature of these regimes of racial violence. So this is a selection, and I believe I review a few things, but I definitely neglect other very important things. You mentioned transportation as a very important form of racial violence, and this is very important because this is not only the main form of racial violence during the conspiracy of La Escalera, but this is also happening in the second half of the 19th century. I'm trying to interpret why the death penalty declines in Brazil, declines in Cuba, and it expands in the US at the eve of emancipation in all of these countries. In my opinion, the death penalty and lynching have to do with democracy in the United States. It's not only about racial slavery, it has to do with democracy. Political systems are different in Cuba and Brazil. In Brazil, the emperor decided to abolish, not only him, but he was one of the main figures deciding to abolish the death penalty to prove that Brazil was a civilized nation. But at the same time, there are other forms of legal and extra-legal violence against people of African descent, and they're just as effective. In Cuba, after like a series of executions in the first half of the 19th century, most military authorities, they choose transportation instead of the death penalty. I think this has to do with the international repercussion after La Escalera, because Spain gets the second age of the Black Legend. So I think there are different problems here, but it is very important to consider that people of African descent in Cuba, they consider transportation to some prisons across the Spanish Empire as terrible as a death penalty, they would say. So I definitely need to talk more about transportation, not as if it's just something that is taking place. This is one of the main forms of legal or almost legal punishment in Cuba.
And in the Malay Revolt, there's also talk about
Yes, that's true. That's true. And there's also the fact that during the Malay Revolt, they try to find executioners like in prison. They refuse to do so, and like the state cannot perform this very like ritualized execution of capital punishment against them, and that's a very interesting thing. And just your last comment, like you talk about patrols and the army, and I think it is fundamental to think about the role of state violence, not only the justice system, but the army itself and patrols too. And I think of slavery as a permanent, I keep talking about permanent state of exception, but I think of slavery as a permanent state of war. So it is fundamental that the state offers this institutional violence to preserve slavery. And analyzing why the army is so powerful in Cuba, especially comparing to Brazil and to the United States when it comes to repress enslaved people. This has to do with the political regime in Cuba that allows this permanent state of war to be actually permanent. But this is something I can mention a little bit more my perspective on this in the paper.
Thank you. It's a terrific paper. I just want to recommend one book if you don't know.
Please.
Jason Sharple's. Have you?
I don't think so. Please.
The World That Fear Made: Slave Revolts and Conspiracies in the Anglo, I think, world.
Oh,
I mean, it's 17th and 18th century.
Perfect.
But it's really enlightening on how fear, in fact, I mean, it's waves of conspiracies that are linked to fears among white population, and how that, in fact, you can really follow the rumors, how they cross the ocean. So it's quite interesting, a little bit in parallel with the witch hunt as well.
it's very interesting to talk about conspiracies because most experiences of actual legal violence were based on rumor, on conspiracies, on alleged conspiracies that eventually never existed. They tell us much more about white anxieties than necessarily about black resistance. They may, but not necessarily. It's an open conversation, guys, and everyone who wants to join.
First, my apologies for being way through. I had to go to the restroom. I am curious a bit about the perpetrators of violence, and specifically, I'm wondering about the individuals who actually are leaders of lynch mobs or government executioners or things like that. Because I ask about this in part because when I've come across similar instances in the Jamaican context, there's a lot of social program distancing. People don't want to fill that role, even if they wholeheartedly believe in the system of white supremacy, racial slavery, black inferiority. And I'm curious how the societies in either of your contexts view the role of the person who administers this kind of punishment, and how thinking about that figure might help us understand more about how each of these societies think about the administration of violence itself, not just racial violence as like an abstract concept that elites and enslavers are okay with, but the actual act of the violence. Does this make sense?
Yes. Do you want to begin, Mike?
Well, I wonder if comparing the American South context versus the Jamaican context, if this has to do with, again, with this popular sovereignty inheritance of the American Revolution. So this is really grabbed by Southern whites of all kinds, and certainly including non-slaveholding whites. This notion that the government is rooted in them and their authority, which is profoundly racialized. And so there's no reluctance to engage in this kind of violence, whereas in the British colonial context, despite the fact that it's highly racialized in different ways, nonetheless there is this sort of this understanding of rule of law and it's not fair play at all, but sort of a British understanding, self-understanding of fair play and so on, which makes violence to be kind of distasteful and to be avoided. Of course, it was occurring in a horrible way, nonetheless, but maybe differently configured. So I think that this may be one of the consequences of the American Revolution, how that transforms American culture, and it takes a particular racial configuration.
Michael, if I just may enter this discussion. When most studies I read about racial violence in the American South, they mention that usually poor whites were the most people participating in these mobs, as if people white people from the elite were against it. But there are episodes in which it's messy. So I just wondered, what are your thoughts about this discussion?
Yeah, it's quite complicated. I think it just really varies. I mean, sometimes this is mainly lower class whites, but often it's much more mixed, or there's even elite leadership.
Yeah.
So I think it just really depends on kind of the particular local context, and if kind of the larger history of Southern lynching, I view it as it's more of eventually it does work out in a kind of a class division, but it's sort of rural whites versus urban middle class whites. But that's a division that develops late 19th century, early 20th century.
Can I just interject something? And what about, because at the moment of the Civil War, at the beginning of it, if I'm not incorrect, white planters were dispensed from and fighting at the beginning according to the number of enslaved workers they owned. So would that have had an impact on also tensions among white community, or you could?
Yeah, I mean, this certainly increases the divisions among Southern whites, and it plays a role in the eventual defeat of the Confederacy. This resentment on the part of lower class whites. It may even play a role within some of the lynchings of enslaved persons that occurred in the Civil War.
It is interesting that I'm going to bring this discussion. Like, I'm analyzing a few episodes of extralegal violence, not necessarily mob violence in the Mississippi Valley in the 1830s, 1820s. It's interesting that usually planters, they try to organize the safety committees, this vigilance committees. They try to present some kind of formality to the whole thing, even though it's extralegal. But they usually lose control over the whole thing because mobs are like participating in the process, and when they disagree because they acquitted someone, mobs take justice into their own hands. So this class division is also taking place in the US in the 1830s. But like, I'm trying to think about your question like in a broader way. A few information that might be interesting, like overseers in Brazil, overseers in the Caribbean, overseers in the US, this was not considered a privileged job. One of the reasons was because they were the violent hand of the masters, and many planters hired overseers so that they could be the benevolent figure and they never get their hands dirty. So there is this idea that like more violence is not that good in the 19th century Americas. However, this is also like just a public image of the whole thing, because behind the doors they are just being as violent as everyone else. But I could say something else about that. We can think about executioners for instance. In Brazil, most executioners were enslaved men who were sentenced to death and transformed into an executioner. And I find this very revealing, because this is a strategy of like, even capital punishment against enslaved people is executed by enslaved people. This is a strategy like white hands do not get dirty in the process. And this was something that happened in Brazil during most of the 19th century. This is just an example. When it comes to Cuba, it's different because violence is everywhere, and it's usually some kind of military violence. So the death penalty is ritualized in Cuba as most of the time as a military execution of capital punishment. Sometimes they use hanging, not that much. The garrote machine becomes very popular in the Spanish Empire, but that is usually for common crimes. Those who committed serious crimes, and they were like black people threatening the Spanish rule over Cuba or threatening the slave racial order, they were executed by firing squads. And the aesthetics of the death penalty says something about this political and racial regime. So I'm not answering your question directly, but I'm just mentioning that there are different ways in which violence is performed. People who execute are different in each society. And there's also the fact that when the abolitionist movement gets strong, that's, especially if we think about Cuba and Brazil, and this is the second half of the 19th century, this is when they use these episodes of extreme violence and they denounce this on newspapers, and then it becomes a problem. Until then, like, this is something that is happening in the Anglo-Saxon French world, not that much in Brazil and Cuba.
Thank you.
My pleasure. What else, guys? It's up to you. The panel just goes until you
Oh, I have a
have
question.
questions. Please.
Then don't get mad at my question. This is also a question to myself. But I'm just wondering, and this is, both of you are writing about kind of spectacular acts of violence as an expression of white fear, of state or planter power, of class power. Do you think are ways to write about and talk about these forms of violence, but that doesn't make it all about white people
Yeah.
and how they feel about themselves?
Yeah.
You know, in the end, like it's still disappearing the victims, right?
Yeah.
In a way. Yeah. So I'm just wondering, like, is there a way to still? We have to talk about these things, right? And we have to talk about the way that white power and white fear operates, but can we still do it in a way that's not just all about them?
This
What do you
is
think?
I'm gonna.
And I say this because my own chapter that I shared is also, I think I have the same issue.
This is a very important
Yeah.
issue. Like in my chapter, I told that I begin
Yeah.
the chapter mentioning people who were enslaved in Africa. They come to the plantation. I tell the story of some of these people.
Yeah.
Like I try to do a little bit to show this more humane version of their history. The problem is that sources are brutal and the historical process itself is brutal. So sometimes it's difficult to tell this story without telling just a brutal story.
Yeah.
What I do, I try in my presentation, I focus on racial violence itself. In the book, I try to present these episodes of slave or like black resistance, and then I focus on repression. So I try to bring a little bit of both to show who these people were before they became victims. The problem is that we can do that when we analyze insurrections, for instance. When we talk about these conspiracies, like most sources, they don't tell us much about this story. So all we have is repression itself and the names of people who suffered these forms of violence. So I try to do a little bit of this, but to be very honest, it's difficult. And like, I don't want my book to sound like a neo-abolitionist manifesto. Like, of course, slavery was violent. I'm trying to interpret the differences, the significance of different regimes of violence in these societies. But I'm trying at least, especially in the beginning and end of each chapter, to review who these people were. And it's difficult to do so, especially when we're telling like the history of 3 different societies at the same time. Like, but I definitely agree, this should be the challenge. How can we deal with the fact that archives, there's so much silence in the archives, as you mentioned earlier. How can we tell the story of these people when we don't have enough information? And how can we bring them to life even before they were like terribly executed? This is a challenge.
One little recommendation for that, it's the book by Marjorie Cars,
Blood on the River.
Blood on the River,
Yeah.
because
I haven't
it's,
read it.
you haven't read it?
I bought it. It's on my bookshelf.
Okay, it's really fascinating.
Okay.
I had read her articles before,
Mm.
but I mean, it's the case of this major slave rebellion on Berbice, where the rebels really control the whole colony, which is mostly along the rivers, but during almost half a year. But also she shows how difficult it is to maintain a revolution or revellion, and all the inside fighting, the violence of the rebels against other enslaved people, especially also the violence against women, and then problems that we don't think about. But you know, it's the rainy season. Suddenly people don't have food to eat anymore. And the Dutch, when they finally managed to arrive at the boats and to subdue the rebellion, a lot of these enslaved people sort of were relieved, because it was not the terrible life in the jungle with nothing to eat. And they took declaration of most of these people, and she built a book out of that. It's really, it's fascinating. And after that you understand why only the Haitian Revolution won, and after 13 years of struggle, and I think it's a totally different history. And also, if you want to, not to think that it could have happened elsewhere, you compare Haiti with the Guadeloupe, and you understand that Haiti was really unique in its case. But I really recommend it. It's she shouldn't have given that title. I think she should have given a title that's much more kind of appealing, you know. Because it's really about a major, probably the second largest rebellion in the whole American world.
Yeah, just to respond as well. Yeah, this is it's a very important problem in doing this kind of work. And, I wrote a historiographical essay for the Journal of American History about 10 years ago, and I discussed this a little bit there. I've learned a lot from the work of Kadada Williams, who I mentioned earlier, and her approach is similar to what I think you just described. So she's looking at Reconstruction, violence against African Americans in the South, and she uses the testimony of African Americans in the congressional hearings that were held in the suppression of the Ku Klux Klan in the early 1870s, and so this is really rich testimony, and it really allows her to get at the experiences of the Black communities that were targeted by the violence. So I'm not happy with how I've dealt with this over the years, but I've tried to sort of integrate some of these techniques, and certainly to include Black voices when at all possible, and to remember that these are human beings targeted with the horrific violence. But it is a real challenge.
I have a crazy idea around that, and I know it's crazy. And it's first is so how the question is how much again are we circumscribing ourselves to our respective disciplines? I wonder if this because I can actually not even hear your frustration, feel your frustration when you're trying to answer that essential question, and I wonder if trying to, as we say, thinking outside of the box, outside of the methodologies and the usual data, or where we go to find the data, etc., would have not helped us to everyone. Even so, I am not only talking about political science or history, on any of our Eurocentrically conceived disciplines. If we just say, well, okay, I am a historian or a political scientist or whatever I am, but what if I just want to do this and to tackle this problem? My problem is I want to, so as a scholar, well, I want to say this, I want to express this, I want to find something around this question. And I feel that what the tools that have been given to me are not enough. So how can I invent other tools? And so this is particularly, so going beyond the abstraction of my crazy idea, is what about thinking about, so trying to find out, again, data and information, archival information or whatever kind of information, and the ways in which these populations are resistant and overcome that violence. Even if this violence happened in the 19th century, and it was in the beginnings of the early century, the early 20th century, when the modes of resistance to come to survive, to overcome that violence were implemented by, in this case, the Black population. And there probably we have some of this information. And why do I come to this, again, crazy idea? Because I don't know how you are going to do that. I'm just throwing the bomb. Well, there was a moment, Michael, where you, where you quote somebody that I want to know who was, sorry, something like the white man was, I suppose, like a prison enough. No, if there was a Black woman who says so.
Yes.
And
yes,
but I couldn't get her name. And this is for me a way, because there is everything. And this phrase is everything. So the problem is, so for this woman and her communities, that they clearly identify at that time when she said that the problem wasn't actually the institutions, was just the system. And this is now when we are realizing that it was a system and not the overseer, etc. So, and she knew it. And just going into that kind of discourse that sometimes is written discourse. So maybe we can find ways not to focus, so to go finally getting out of the prison. We are right now within clear, the same actual prison that this woman that I want to find her.
Yes, I talked
Yeah,
about
so
George,
yes, I know it's crazy,
yeah,
but
yeah.
this is my ruminations after this question.
Yeah, well, thank
So
you.
who was it?
Octavia George, and this is from the WPA Slave Narratives, and she was interviewed in Louisiana.
And where we find the
It's in the footnote, it should be footnote 26, yeah.
This is why I love historians.
And it's an authorized source for historians.
Yes.
We can,
Some-
we
yeah,
can use
some
that.
people-
Yeah, I love that.
Yes.
I don't go to the archive, but you go. This is great.
Yes, we go.
Here
Well, it's
it
based
is.
on interviews.
Yes, we do.
Sorry, I'm going to.
It's based on interviews that were done in the 1930s.
I'd like
It's
to,
on the Library of Congress, yeah?
Yeah, they've been published in.
Oh,
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
No, I'm not
published
used to
in
things
volumes, yeah.
But I can
For me, it's a wonderful source that could have existed also for Cuba and
Yeah.
Brazil.
that's our dream.
Nothing like that.
Oh my gosh,
It's so
can
amazing.
I take a picture of it?
Sure.
You can discover a whole world there. It's
Yeah.
extraordinary.
I wanted to say something about Odette's comment. First of all, like, thank you for giving the suggestion, like pushing us like beyond the limits of our
Thank you.
field. I was I was originally planning to the title of my book was supposed to be The Dialectics of Racial Violence. And I was thinking of dialectics because I can only explain regimes of racial violence if I'm analyzing experiences of Black resistance. First of all, they hated the dialectics, so they just excluded the world. And then they said that I spend too much time with descriptive and narrative of this history instead of bringing the analytical interpretation of racial violence itself. So I love this type of workshop because it pushes us everywhere. I'm using like all of the time biographies, autobiographies written by enslaved people. That's how I begin chapter 2. I use Muhammad Bakwakwa, the only autobiography we have of someone who was enslaved in Brazil. Juan Francisco Manzano, the only one who wrote a biography being in Cuba. And Solomon Northup, not the only one, but one of the African Americans who wrote an autobiography. And I begin with their story until I arrive at these plantation societies. And then it's tricky because a few of them, they mention experiences of racial violence and I use them and their perspectives, but most sources are not connected to their history and these people, they just disappear. So it's a challenge. And I appreciate that you're pushing us to do more than we're doing right now because we need to. Maybe we don't have the tools because we're thinking within this epistemologic prison that you mentioned.
Or maybe it's there.
It's for the
Yes.
US.
Actually there.
Yeah,
It's,
this exists for the US.
With this phrase, you just put everything. It was there. The white man was a real prison. Because everything is there. Yeah.
It is
And the
easier to do
problem-
this when we talk about the second half of the 20th century because there are more sources. And that's what I will try to do in the second part of the book. And I believe
And
that's what Michael is doing.
also with those autobiographies is well, we know that they were in
That's true.
what political context, in nationalistic political context, they were not only written but published.
Yeah, that's
especially
true.
the
Yeah.
Manzano's autobiography,
Yeah.
because it's there. But again, it's
It is, but it's what we have. And like, if we have to analyze judicial sources, understanding the political powers behind, we can do the same with like slave narrative. And
yeah.
we may then conclude this section. We have then like 38 minutes for a coffee break.
Ay,
That works.
es siesta antes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for your
Thank
comments.
you.
For your
Thank you.
yourselves,
Yeah.
whatever you want with you and the research and what you're doing here.
myself. I'm Felipe Oliveira. I'm Brazilian. I'm here because I got a scholarship in the project of resistance. I'm in 30 years of PhD student in Lisboa. My research talking about civil cases involving slaves and freedmen, indigenous people during the 18th century in São Paulo, Brazil. And I tried to discover how these people were producing normativities and legal culture during the 18th century. And the civil cases involving claim for freedom, for land, for possession. So that's what I'm doing now. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
And you understand, of course, why I invited him. He's here and he's trying to do something that I brought to this event precisely because I don't think we do it enough. I don't do it in my own research, like bringing intersection between indigenous people, people of African descent, to rethink the meaning of race and perhaps racial violence in the Americas. So we have here Yuko Miki, Matt Scott. They're the ones offering the presentations now. Leonora Mazzini is going to be the commentator, and then we have enough time to discuss as much as we want before dinner. So please, Yuko, the floor is yours.
Hi, good afternoon. I hope you all, this is like the energy drop moment of the day. I'm very aware of that, so I hope you got to walk. I wanted to start by thanking Marcelo for the invitation and to everybody here at the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. And I was just, as I was sharing with you, I went here as an undergrad a long time ago at this point, but it was just like nice. I just took a break to go to my old apartment and but I was also just remember, speaking of race and such, I just remember I had come from Japan as an international student. So it was here in Providence that I first learned that I was Asian. Because I never thought about myself that way, right? Growing up in a country where everybody else looked like me. So I was just kind of remembering those things, and also how I used to go to bate-papos. I don't know if they still have them at the Portuguese Brazilian Studies Department. Not because I was doing Latin American history, but because they had free food. And that's what always works. If you want students to show up, you must provide free food. And the people are very nice. And I was also, not to date myself, but I think I was among the last people to have the chance to take class with Tom Skidmore. I was studying Renaissance Italy, but I was developing a marginal interest in Latin America at that time. But it took still 5 more years after graduating to finally get into studying Latin America. So it was a very meandering path, but I have a lot I owe to my experience in my time that I was here at Brown. And for just to make it more, for the communication's sake, I was talking to Gina, que eu vou tentar falar rapidinho, depois eu falar em inglês, né? Do que estou dizendo em português também. So for this symposium, Marcelo asked me to share some thoughts on the topic of race and violence as they relate to the intersection of indigenous and African descended people in Brazil. And I think that behind your request, Marcelo, is something so obvious that it's been taken for granted when we're talking about race in Brazil, which is that, it must be, obviously we're talking about Blackness. But this presumption takes me back to the challenges I faced in writing my own book. This is kind of the cover art from that. I too had set out to write a book about Black Brazilians and their resistance to slavery. But ultimately, I decided that it was necessary to think about the intersecting histories of Black and Indigenous people, which is not at all as straightforward as it sounds. But what am I doing that reveal about the intersection of race, nation, and citizenship? E então, eu estava dizendo que Marcelo me impediu de falar de raça, mas com a interseção de histórias negras e indígenas. E para mim, a gente acha que Brasil deve ser raça, então é história negra, né? Mas no meu caso, porque eu cheguei no ponto de pesquisar os dois, né? Que não foi um caminho muito óbvio para mim, mas como é que eu cheguei nesse ponto? So for the rest of the presentation, I'd like to start with the idea of the power of storytelling. I want to think about how our narration of the past erases Indigenous people from the present, and why I decided to write against that story. I'll then discuss several examples of anti-Indigenous violence in Brazil's transition from colony to nation. These include explicit acts such as the resurgence of Indigenous slavery and massacres of entire villages, but also as well in the realm of discourse. What I want to consider is how anti-Indigenous violence is inextricable from its erasure, and what that says about Indigenous people's place in colonial Brazil. I'll conclude by thinking about the importance, but also the limitations of allowing an epistemology of violence to shape the ways in which we narrate Indigenous and Black lives. This is something I'm thinking a lot about right now, obviously, since this morning it's been obvious. And I want to take advantage of being here with all of you today to think more about it. So I'll be drawing on some examples from my first book, Frontiers of Citizenship, as well as a new book I'm currently writing about on the illegal slave trade, and another smaller piece about an African society in Brazil. So então eu vou começar falando do poder das narrativas, né, dos contos, né? Como é que nós narramos o passado nesse processo nós... How do you say to erase? Borrar? No, to erase. Apagamos a presença indígena na história. Então, eu vou falar sobre alguns exemplos de violência anti-indígena na transição do Brasil da colônia ao Brasil Império, né? Falando de vários tipos de exemplos de violência e também como apagar a violência também é muito importante para falar da história indígena. E também eu quero concluir pensando em como a epistemologia da violência também, temos que pensar na violência, mas também isso também pode limitar o nosso olhar para pensar nas vidas e histórias negras e indígenas. Eu vou falar sobre meu livro, que já publiquei, mas sobre também os novos projetos. Sorry, anybody feel free to correct my Portuguese. No, it's, I say, my Portuguese is made up. So first I want to talk about some background and the power of storytelling through these Black Indigenous histories. So I should mention first, because I think it's relevant to this workshop, why I decided to write about Black and Indigenous people in Brazil. There's a lot more work that does that now, which is amazing. But it certainly wasn't at all what I had set out to do. I had intended to write a history of the resistance of enslaved African-descended people in Brazil within the context of the larger African diaspora and the Black radical tradition. Like many, I had taken for granted the story about the Americas that we all know. The one that says, first they were indigenous people. They were decimated by colonial violence and disease and were replaced by enslaved Africans. We hear this story all the time, and it's supposed to explain why Brazil has a large Black population. So when I began my research, I presumed that I too would, like many others before me, focus on Brazil's African descendant population and their struggle for freedom in the decades following independence. Então, eu estou questionando a narrativa muito estabelecida em que houve índios no primeiro foram dizimados pela violência e doenças e depois vieram os escravos africanos. Por isso o Brasil é uma nação negra, né? É uma história que nós aceitamos muitas vezes. So I was therefore completely unprepared by what I found in the archives. Quilombos and slave revolts in the frontiers of the then provinces of Bahia and Espírito Santo. Yes, amazing. But also an abundance of sources on indigenous people, mostly identified as the Botocudo, right on the Atlantic seaboard in the middle of the 19th century, and often in violent conflict with settlers. Hadn't indigenous people disappeared long ago? Why were they here, and why did we learn next to nothing about them? Então, quando eu descobri fontes indígenas nos arquivos no século XIX, eu não estava preparada, né? Eu não esperava encontrar fontes indígenas no período pós-colonial, na Atlântica, no litoral atlântico. So only gradually did I begin to see that the story itself was an act of erasure. So these are perhaps familiar images, and you were talking about crania earlier, right, with your work. So this was an act of erasure. This act of erasure has its origins in the idea of indigenous extinction, which was created in the mid to later 19th century by a confluence of state and local interests. By promoting the idea that indigenous people were simply disappearing or fated to do so shortly of their own accord, extinction discourse erased the ongoing practice of land seizure and anti-indigenous violence that was integral to the conquest of the frontier indigenous territories in the 19th century. Even state-sponsored gentle indigenous policy was premised on the miscegenation and eventual disappearance of indigenous people. Patriotic romantic Indianist art, like the famous example on the left, and anthropological studies of the Botocudo, like the one from the Museo Nacional on the right, and of course their crania, right, because they have to measure the crania. These further promoted the idea that indigenous people belonged in the past, but never in the national present. Thus, I realized that by ignoring indigenous Brazilians as historical subjects in the 19th century, many of us scholars were only perpetuating the story and participating in a form of narrative violence even when we were driven by good intentions, for example, because I wanted to write about the resistance of African descended people. Então, eu estava dizendo que a ideia da extinção dos povos indígenas foi inventada no século IX, né? Tipo de parte do projeto nacional, que incluía discursos de mestiçagem, né? Que fazia parte da política indigenista, em que a mestiçagem era para desaparecer os índios, né? Para incluí-los no corpo nacional. So ultimately, what I decided to do was not to just reinsert indigenous people back into history, but to think about how the interconnected histories of Black and indigenous people could illuminate Brazilian history, because for only then, I thought, can we have a better understanding of these fundamental issues that post-colonial Latin American nations faced, like slavery and abolition, like the unequal access to citizenship, and the constructions of racialized difference and national identity. I think this is particularly important when we're talking about race and racial violence in Brazil. Why? Because the nation's new elite embraced this remarkably inclusive national identity in the mid-19th century based on the race mixture of white, Black, and Indian, the so-called three races. There's even, of course, a samba song with that title by Clara Nunes, right? O Canto das Três Raças. This idea has been remarkably enduring in contemporary Brazil, where it's better known under the name racial democracy. The idea associated, of course, with Gilberto Freire, that because of Brazil's history of race mixture, there is no racism. While many scholars of race in Brazil over the decades have rightly criticized this idea, especially by documenting the persistence of anti-Black racism, indigenous people are largely marginalized in these conversations. They are, at best, an afterthought. Então, a questão não era só de reinserir os indígenas na história brasileira, mas pensar o que podemos aprender das questões como a cidadania, a escravidão, nação, identidade nacional, quando pensamos tanto nos indígenas como nos povos negros. E também que quando nós pensamos em democracia racial, as mestiçagens, muita gente, na verdade, está falando das relações negras e brancos, mas os indígenas não cabem muito nessas conversa sobre mestiçagem, muitas vezes, né? Okay. So by bringing together the histories of Black and indigenous people, in my book I argued that this inclusive national racial identity was actually built upon the exclusion and inequality of both groups and how violence was integral to these processes. An incredibly rich scholarship has documented the remarkable ways in which Black Brazilians enslaved and free resisted their subjugation. But in my book, I showed that we need to look further. The Brazilian state's erasure of anti-indigenous violence under the guise of extinction has been so effective that for a long time, many of us had accepted indigenous disappearance as fact. The erasure became the story. Então, também falando nessa identidade nacional inclusiva, tínhamos que pensar em como a exclusão dos povos negros e indígenas era integral esse processo da inclusão, né, nacional. Mas também que nós temos que sempre pensar em como apagamento da violência anti-indígena faz parte dessa narrativa do passado. So, to take a closer look at the centrality of anti-indigenous violence in modern Brazil, let's travel back to the early 19th century to the indigenous frontier territories. The 7th of September, 1822, the official date of Brazilian independence, was a time of war. Later known as the Botocudo Wars, it had begun on 13th of May of 1808 with a declaration by João VI, only recently arrived from Portugal with their royal family because, of course, they were fleeing the Napoleonic invasions. The Botocudo Indians were, in the Prince Regent's words, an atrocious anthropophagus race whose refusal to accept Portuguese rule had given him, quote, the just motives to suspend the effects of humanity and to declare an offensive war. But the war hadn't started then, really. Settlers' animosity toward the Botocudo had been brewing for a few decades already, and the Prince Regent had only given them official sanction. Então, estou falando que só quando, já na época da independência, o Brasil estava no meio de uma guerra contra os índios botocudos nas fronteiras do Bahia Espírito Santo, né? É muita linguagem, muito racista da antropofagia. And so these were the kind of examples of images that circulated of the botokudo. And you can see, right, that the the eating of human flesh that they were accused of. There was a time when settlers had dared not to enter these territories where the Bahia Espírito Santo Minas Gerais converged because the crown prohibited it, but more so because they feared the botokudo, with all the rumors of cannibalism and stories of people who disappeared in the forest only to show up as femurs and rib cages. And a lot of these stories circulate, but without much foundation. But as the settlers depleted the mines of the interior, which yielded less and less with each passing year, all they could see now was a lush, virginal forest stretching towards the Atlantic Ocean, teeming with untapped riches. The only thing standing in their way now were these Indians who, as they saw it, infested the land. And that's often the language they use, is infestation. They needed to be subjugated or removed. Então, tinha muito medo dos índios botocudos a causa da antropofagia, mas com a depredação das minas no interior, eles querem conquistar a terra, né? Terras indígenas dos índios. So Brazilian nationhood thus inaugurated amidst the conquest of indigenous territories in an offensive war that reauthorized the Indians' enslavement. Racialized tropes of botocudo cannibalism helped justify their violent subjugation. Indigenous people deemed too savage and resistant to civilization were enslaved and held captive for 10 years or as long as their ferocity lasted. And these are all quotes from the sources. This was, of course, an ambiguous condition that was ripe for abuse. Many were forced off their lands onto aldeias, or indigenous villages, and into the service of unscrupulous settlers who kept them in bondage indefinitely. Indigenous children, known as curucas, were traded and trafficked, some as far as Rio de Janeiro. Então, a escravidão indígena recomeça no 1808 e dura muito depois da independência, né? The Botocudo Wars would officially continue until 1831, when indigenous slavery was abolished, but the latter would continue illegally for decades more. The conquest of indigenous people and their land would be enabled by and inseparable from the expansion of African-based slavery into these indigenous territories, with Africans also imported into Brazil long after the transatlantic slave trade was abolished, also in 1831, which I think is significant. And allowing indigenous and African slavery to outlast Brazil's transition from colony to nation, both legally and illegally, the new Brazilian state effectively ensured the existence of categories of people who, as slaves, were excluded from citizenship. Então, nessa época, você vê a contemporaneidade da escravidão negra e indígena nos territórios novamente conquistados, e que eles então entram na nova nação como escravos, então negados da cidadania negada, né? Então, so sometimes, however, we just talked about enslavement. Enslavement, forced removal were not enough, and this is the part that was included partly in the chapter that we uploaded in the shared drive. In the chapter shared with you, I discuss a very specific form of anti-indigenous violence called matar uma aldeia, or the killing of an entire indigenous village, which followed a very specific transcript, whether it took place in 1830 or in 1881. And there are many other examples. I discussed in particular the horrific massacre of a community of Nok-Nok Indians by a group of settlers and their indigenous guides, and how the legal system ultimately perverted the proceedings until ultimately the occurrence of the massacre itself was erased. I juxtapose my analysis of this case of the indigenous massacre with the 1884 clandestine murder and castration of an enslaved Black man named Serafim in the town of Espírito Santo in the town of São Mateus in northern Espírito Santo. His killers were the men of the white slave-owning family whose widowed daughter, Serafim the enslaved, had impregnated through what was likely a consensual relationship. I argued that when we study these two cases of extravagant violence together in relation to the law, we see how the expansion of laws protecting enslaved Black people, and this is maybe because it's a little after the period that Marcelo was discussing. For example, there are more laws that curtailed the master's right to punish their slaves at will, even though Serafim was killed. that these laws and the expansion of such laws curtailing violence against the enslaved contrast starkly with the absence of any laws protecting the indigenous, who were effectively placed outside Brazil's body of laws. Indigenous people, I said, were made killable. So the larger argument here was that, in a way, it's important to kind of think about slavery, punishment of slavery, laws about the punishment of slavery, masters' rights. But that kind of is like hermetically sealed. You kind of think about expanding rights, diminishing rights, but what about when we juxtapose it with indigenous people? Like, you just realize there's actually no laws protecting them at all. There's nothing there. So I think that shows that it's not just that subaltern people's citizenship expands or decreases. At the same time, it's like they're actually differential. And I think that was important to show. Então, falando de exemplos de violência anti-indígena, matar uma aldeia, atos de violência muito específica, espetacular, mas também argumentando que se você fala de reis controlando, limitando o direito dos mestres a punir os escravos, não tem leis, não existe nada para proteger os indígenas. Não tem. Então, os indígenas são como, não pertencem ao corpo das leis da nação. So, to conclude, I want to kind of think about going beyond violence. So even as I share some of my work on anti-Indigenous and anti-Black violence, I am acutely aware that violence was precisely the lens through which Indigenous lives became visible to me in the archives. Clashes with settlers, slavery, massacre, forced removal. In other words, even though we must recognize the foundational role of anti-Indigenous violence in post-colonial Brazilian history, and we also have to write against the narrative of Indigenous extinction, that focus on violence is also my limitation. I am incapable of seeing and narrating Indigenous lives otherwise. To paraphrase my recent conversation with a scholar of African and diasporic art and spirituality, Barbara Martinez Ruiz, that's why I was talking to him, our work must always contend with the epistemology of violence and think and see otherwise. I grapple with this daily in my current project on the illegal slave trade, a narrative history that traces the slave ship Mary Smith that sailed from Boston to the Congo River and from there to Brazil. The mortality aboard was horrific. The ship's archives overwhelm me daily with the prevalence and mundanity of violence, suffering, and death. Is it possible that even as I write about this horrific trade in human beings, I can imagine the lives of Africans beyond the epistemology of violence? How do we narrate their complex humanity that is not reducible to their encounter with violence? Então, pensando na violência é importante, narrá-la é importante, mas também minha limitação, porque, sobretudo com o tráfico ilegal de africanos, história indígena, eu só vejo eles por meio da violência, né? Não tem uma vida fora disso. Para mim, é minha limitação, eu estou dizendo. So to explore this question, I want to close today by briefly discussing a parallel piece I've been working on about a West Central African society called Pemba that entered the Brazilian archives in 1860. That year, slaveholders in the coffee-growing region of Itapemirim in Espírito Santo in Brazil denounced this Pemba society for allegedly plotting an insurrection to kill whites. Matar os brancos, right? An African-based society planning an insurrection against enslavers is exactly the kind of archival gold we historians of popular resistance seek. So when I first saw it, I was like, yes, I've got this. Falou que era escravidão, né? Insurreição africana contra branco. Queremos isso, né? The Pemba members refused to speak of it, but also denied insurrectionary intent, merely stating that Pemba's purpose was to amansar os senhores, to tame the masters, which was a somewhat common expression under Brazilian slavery. And John Hayes talks about that expression in one of his books. The conflicting testimonies and silences characterizing many archives of insurrection have often led scholars to one of two conclusions. One, that the enslaved were concealing their complicity in an actual insurrection plot, or two, conversely, that the insurrection was an invention of slaveholder paranoia. Both analyses, however, are shaped and thus limited by the logic of the archives. To make, was there or wasn't there an insurrection? The central question traps us in an echo chamber of slaveholder epistemology whose archives were created to invent Black violence and criminality and to narrate the ultimate triumph of white law and order. Thus, in these archives, Black life and politics remain obscure. So, então, os brancos dizem que os participantes da Pemba queriam matar os brancos. Eles dizem que não, só queríamos amassar os senhores. Mas se nós só pensamos, houve uma insurreição ou foi uma invenção? Você não sai da lógica dos escravizadores, né? Que a obsessão deles é só falar sobre a violência negra ou a controle branco sobre a violência negra. Então, é possível sair dessa epistemologia, né? É a minha questão. Pemba is some familiar term in the West Central African diaspora in Brazil. Depending on the language, such as Kikongo or Kimbundu, Pemba, Mpemba, Pembe signify chalk, the color white, the powders used to make things white, and the spiritual realm of the ancestors. And of course, you spoke about spirituality and cosmology. As a color or substance, Pemba refers to purification, calm, and initiation into spiritual societies. The term retains tremendous spiritual resonance today, especially in the Afro-Brazilian religions of Umbanda and Candomblé Angola. Oh, I think I forgot one of the slides. Sorry. Sorry, it's out of order. So things like this, right? So this is from Umbanda, I think. In their testimonies given to the police, the members describe their initiation or baptism in which their leader, Narciso Mina, interestingly Mina, known among them as Tata Abranda o Mundo, or Father makes the world gentle, who makes the world gentle, drew crosses on their arms with a whitish thing that looked like ash. They said, uma coisa branquinha que parecia de cinza. After which they passed under his legs. They worshipped a figure of St. Anthony and danced the jongo, which is still performed today among rural Black communities in Rio and Sao Paulo. The purpose of Pemba, they said, was to make the masters tame, to control their zanga, right, their anger. The members wore white caps and carried red sticks in their mouths for protection, or that's what they said. Então, só dizendo que Pemba é muito conhecido dentro do Brasil, né, na Umbanda, etc., e que os participantes só diziam que faziam desenhos no corpo, diziam as cruzes no corpo com essa cinza branca, que dançavam jongo, etc., mas não falavam de intentos violentos. Their master, Antonio Silva, was a brutal man who regularly beat the enslaved. Their suffering is palpable. And I would say he is the only concrete evidence of violence is by the master. But no one problematizes that, of course. And yet, without diminishing it in any way, I cannot shake the sense that there's something fundamentally limited in concluding that Pemba's purpose was just that, to tame the violence of slavery. This reduces Pemba to the slaveholder's epistemological world. I initially saw Pemba, as the archives presented it, as an African religion in Brazilian slave society with possible insurrection links. Of course, I'm not at all negating that possibility. But as a historian of diasporic slavery, I need to remind myself that African spiritualities are not reducible to African people's encounter with slavery. While they undoubtedly inform their resistance, we need to accept them as full complex expressions of spirituality and selfhood that cannot be defined only in relation to the violence of slavery and their resistance to it. Said another way, if the study of enslaved resistance began in our efforts, right, of historians and others to write against the idea of slavery's psychic destruction and the dehumanization, could we also say that to recognize a person's complex humanity, we look beyond violence and the resistance to it? Então, mais perguntas sobre isso, de como pensar no Pemba além da resistência à violência da escravidão, porque isso reduz uma inteira cosmologia africana complexa à sua resistência, né? Isso eu acho que limita a humanidade das pessoas, né? Que será possível olhar além da violência. I had initially spent many hours trying to decipher Pemba's purpose along categories defined by other scholars. Was it a Kimpasi cult of affliction, as Robert Slanis argued? A crisis society? A healing society? A mutual aid society? A political or spiritual organization? What elements are Congo or Mina? Which are Catholic? What parts are syncretic or creolized, right? These are all familiar categories to us, right? Such distinctions, I eventually understood, could satisfy my own desire to categorize and define, but had no resonance for the initiates themselves, because Pemba could encompass all these things and a lot more that I would never know. Would we compartmentalize Christianity or Buddhism into such narrow categories? Probably not. So what Narciso Mina had drawn on the initiates' bodies was probably a Congo cosmogram, a dikenga that symbolized the journey of the soul between the realms of the living and the ancestors. Otherwise, some people call it the 4 moments of the sun. The journey of the soul is like the movement of the sun, right? Bemba, I'm positing, had spiritual links to a lower Congo society called Lamba, which anthropologists Wyatt McGaffey and John Jansen have defined as ritual complexes intending to bring about improvements in the well-being of individuals and groups, curing disease, identifying and punishing wrongdoers, etc., etc. As an uninitiated person, and from the vantage point of 2023, I understand and accept that I cannot understand Pemba's fuller significance. What I'm simply suggesting is that in seeking to understand the initiates' worlds, we need to be careful not to reproduce slaveholders' reductive logic. I take my cue from the initiates themselves. The Africans' bodies are palimpsests. Their flesh burned and scarred by the iron branding that signaled their commodification. But when Narciso Mina drew a cross on those same bodies with Mbemba, they also became vessels connecting them to the ancestral and spiritual realm. Even as I work primarily with manuscripts, Pemba has allowed me to discern a different embodied archive that bleeds into the official archive, crossing not only Atlantic space, but past and present, living and ancestral, whose complexity and richness transport us far beyond the world of slavery. The histories of empires and nations are built on the enslavement and dispossession of Black, Indigenous, and other peoples, centering the histories of racial violence, and the resistance to it remains essential and urgent as we daily see how the politicization of history then and now begins with their erasure. We need to recognize that the same Brazilian nation embracing a new identity based on the mixture of the 3 races was also founded on the preservation of African and Indigenous slavery, which then ensured that these same people remained excluded from citizenship. And mind you, I'm talking about Afro-Brazilian. Africans were never included. At the same time, I am aware that violence could become reductive if we allow it to be the only lens through which we see and narrate Indigenous and Black lives. I am searching for new ways to imagine and tell stories, and I'm hoping to learn more from you. Thank you. And Tom. And Dominic. So, última parte, posso dar?
Okay, well, again, thank you. Thank you, Marcelo, for extending the invitation. I'm very happy to be part of this. It's so enlightening and expansive and thought-provoking as an Americanist, whatever that means, right? All the problematic connotations of that term, right? This is really expanding the way that I think about this history. So thank you all. So the chapter that I shared with you is titled The Summer Sun. And it comes from a quote from Tecumseh. And Tecumseh, when he's organizing this trying to organize this pan-Indian resistance movement, he asked attendants, Indigenous attendants, that is his speech, where today are the Narragansett, the Pequot, and other once great peoples, right? They have, I'm not saying exactly, but they have vanished before the avarice of the white man as snow before the summer sun, right? So this idea of erasure and how powerful it was, right? That Tecumseh and other Indigenous peoples ascribed to it too, right? That these communities have been erased. Now this picture here is very jarring and powerful. And I'm gonna divert a lot from the chapter that was shared and kind of do a case study example of this racial violence and the collapsing of Indigenous and Black identities in the Northeast. Before I start, I want to say Asko Wikwasin, Natasuwis Max Scott, and saying hello, my name is Max Scott, and I'm using the Algonquin language, which is the language of the Indigenous peoples of this region. We are on the ancestral homelands of the Narragansett people, and I just want to take a second to recognize the sacrifices and different circumstances that have brought us here today, right? Okay, so just over a year ago, Foxwoods celebrated its 30th anniversary. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with Foxwoods, 30 years ago, when it was being planned and developed and proposed, it promised to be the largest gaming facility in the world. All right. Obviously, Vegas is bigger, but as a standalone facility, Foxwoods was going to dominate. Of course, something along this magnitude is going to bring lots of attention, lots of interest. And there's a congressional hearing about Foxwoods, and there's people, experts, and stakeholders, people from the community who testify before Congress to talk about the detriments and the positives of the possible construction of this large facility, about an hour or so from where we are right now. So those of you who are looking for something to do tomorrow, that might be your thing. But the hearing itself was in many ways a perfunctory exercise. And the reason why I say that is because there was another hearing about 5 years before this one across the Capitol at the Supreme Court. And at this hearing, it was a case, the justices heard this case, California versus the Carbazon band of Mission Indians. And in this case, what the Supreme Court decided was that California had no right to regulate traditional indigenous practices. And the traditional indigenous practice at debate at this time was gaming, gambling. Gaming, gambling, gift giving, trading has been a part of indigenous communities from time out of mind. And the reason why this debate about Foxwoods was perfunctory, because right after the Supreme Court made the decision, states and the federal government were scrambling to make rules, because what this court had done is essentially made it possible for every indigenous community in America to build a casino on their traditional homelands. So there had to be some sort of regulation. So very quickly, the government comes up with the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act. And according to the Regulatory Act, there's all these stipulations, and they have to do with your indigenous communities and being part of percentages of the group that's going to establish the casino. Long story short, the Mashantucket Pequots were a partner in this endeavor. This is why it was perfunctory, because the court case had already decided that the Mashantucket Pequots have the right to do this, right? They have the right to establish this game facility on their ancestral lands, which is exactly what they were going to do. Well, at this meeting, at the time, the former president, at the time he would be future president, spoke, right? Donald Trump. And he spoke because not too far, within a 3 hours drive from where they proposed to build this huge, the biggest casino the world has ever seen, he owned a casino. It was called the Trump Taj Mahal in Atlantic City. So of course, the construction of this, casino would be a detriment to his bottom line. So he's there that day to testify before Congress to talk about maybe why building this casino wasn't a good idea. So I'm going to play what he had to say.
We're going to judge people by whether they have Indian blood, whether they're qualified to run a gaming casino or not?
That probably is me, absolutely. Because I'll tell you what, if you look at some of the reservations that you've approved, you, sir, your great wisdom have approved, I will tell you right now, they don't look like Indians to me. And they don't look like the Indians. Now, maybe we say politically correct or not politically correct. They don't look like Indians to me, and they don't look like Indians to Indians. And a lot of people are looking at it, and you're telling how tough it is, how rough it is to get approved. When you go up to Connecticut, and you look, now, they don't look like Indians to me, sir.
Thank God that's not the test of whether or not people have rights in this country or not, whether or not they pass your look test.
Depends whether, yeah. Depends whether or not you're approving it, sir.
No, it's not a question whether I'm approving it. It's not a question whether I'm approving it. Mr. Trump, you know in the history of this country where we've heard this discussion before, they don't look Jewish to me.
Oh, really?
They don't look Indian to me. They don't look Italian to me. And that was a test for whether people You're too black. You're not black enough.
So they don't look Indian to me. Everyone understood exactly what Mr. Trump meant, right? He meant that they didn't look the way that he thought they should look, that they didn't have the long black flowing hair in braids with feathers in it, with the regalia, with the beads, right? He was saying that they didn't look like this. They didn't look like Iron Eyes Cody. And for those of you who don't know who Iron Eyes Cody was, he was a famous actor who played indigenous peoples in lots of Hollywood Western movies. He was the actor who was in this ubiquitous commercial about Keep America Beautiful. And he's walking around and there's trash all over the place. And he has the one tear dripping down his face because, you know, indigenous peoples are inextricably tied to the land and to the way things used to be, and that they are not modern people, right? But this is what Mr. Trump was saying, is that they didn't look like Iron Eyes Cody. But the thing is that no indigenous people look like Iron Eyes Cody because Iron Eyes Cody is not an indigenous person. He's Italian. Of course they don't look like Iron Eyes Cody. But that wasn't really the challenge that Mr. Trump was making. He was saying, not that they don't look like Iron Eyes Cody per se, but that they look like the antithesis, right? That they look like they presented a phenotype of African ancestry, some of them, right? And that's what Mr. Trump was using to disqualify the Pequots from being able to build this casino. He didn't challenge the act itself. He didn't challenge the tradition of indigenous gaming. He didn't challenge the sovereignty of indigenous communities. He challenged the authenticity of this group based on what they looked like, right? He was tapping into this long history of anti-Black racism. In 1637, ship the Desire leaves from its port in Salem, Massachusetts, and it's sailing down to the Caribbean with a cargo of 17 captive Pequots. These Pequots had been taken captive in what is today known as the Pequot War. And as being defeated in the battle, they could be taken captive and enslaved. When the Desire returns, it's going to trade those Pequots for enslaved Africans, right? People of African descent. When that ship Desire arrives in Massachusetts, John Winthrop, who was the governor, thanks God, right? And says, this is fortuitous, right? This is going to be our saving grace. We like to forget that the New England colonies were just as much economic ventures as they were religious, right? And that this saving grace was slavery, right? That this slave system is going to undergird the entire economy of the Northeast, especially in Rhode Island. We were talking a little bit earlier, but a lot of people don't realize how important slavery is in Rhode Island, right? 70% of the transatlantic slave voyages leave from ports in Rhode Island. By the mid 18th century, a tenth of the population in Rhode Island is enslaved persons, right? So this is a big thing. And with that comes Rhode Island and colonies in the Northeast are just as much, every bit of a slave society as those large slave plantations of the South, right? This is undergirding the entire system, which means that they are just as much in this system steeped in anti-Black racism as everywhere else in the nation. As more and more peoples of African descent become in this area, there's more opportunities for people to come together. The reason why I have this picture here is I used to live in Hawaii, and in Hawaii, they have these huge, big, beautiful banyan trees. And I wanted to use the banyan tree as an image to kind of talk about the relationships that develop between the Black and Indigenous community in this region. And if we think of the limbs, right, the branches of the banyan tree as the Indigenous communities, right, they're growing out, right, they're doing their thing. And the roots that shoot off of those as the Black communities, right? And what we can see is that they're separate, they're distinct, but they're also connected, right? And not only are they connected, they are nourishing each other, right? They are helping to enrich each other. And that's what happens a lot with the Black and Indigenous community in this region. And if you think about it, it makes sense. The laws that they pass about slavery in New England, the first laws, they relegate slavery to peoples of Black and Indigenous descent, pushing those communities together. The jobs and ways that you're going to be able to work, right, as domestics. Black and Indigenous women are going to be doing those jobs. Working on shipbuilding, right? Black and Indigenous men are going to be doing those jobs, right? So they're going to be segregation, right? And people relegated to the same communities, the same taverns, the same neighborhoods, right? So there's lots of factors pushing these two groups together. But also, there's lots of motivation for these two groups to come together on their own, regardless of those factors. Indigenous people in this region have always determined the parameters of their communities. They have always incorporated others into those communities, right? That's why the colonists were able to be here, right? Because they were incorporated into Indigenous communities, right? That's how it worked. When peoples of African descent move into the area, the same tradition is happening. This is a huge benefit for Indigenous communities because colonial wars were devastating for Indigenous populations, right? And continuing these traditional practices of incorporating people into your community help them to survive, help them to build bigger, stronger, more resilient communities. If you are a person of African descent, you could see the benefits of becoming part of the Indigenous communities, right? If you were an African American man and you were able to run away and join an Indigenous community, and if you look at the advertisements for runaways at this time, you'll find a pattern where the petitioners will say they might have joined an Indigenous community, right? They might have run to the Indians, right? Because this was something that happened. And if you were and you did that, your children would be born part of the community. They'd be born free, right? There's huge motivations here. For Indigenous peoples, there's huge motivation. Euro-Americans didn't import peoples of African descent because it was not profitable, right? This is extremely profitable. And of course, Indigenous peoples are going to attempt to capitalize on that also. There's a story that I like to tell of William Brown, who in 1770 talked about how his grandmother, and that's the quote that we have here, purchased a person of African descent so that she could marry him, so that she could live in the manner after white folks, right? So she could capitalize on his labor, right? And live in a different station because he could have jobs and make money that she wasn't able to have access to without him being part of her household, right? So we see lots of reasons for these communities to come together. For Indigenous men, there's not lots of opportunity here. There's lots of death, right? Colonial wars were devastating for Indigenous persons. And then the opportunities that do exist are things like whaling, right? Which would take you from the region for years at a time, right? So there's lots of motivations for these communities to come together. But in so doing, there's the intermixing. There's the marriage. And in America, we have this extreme anti-Black racism that we all know, we all talk about. And it's so extreme that it means that if there's any intermixing, it is with peoples of African descent, it's a degradation, right? It's an erasure of indigeneity, right? It's so powerful. I like to tell we all know the story of Plessy v. Ferguson. Well, Homer Plessy was 1/8 black. He had a great grandmother who was black. He presented as white. He bought his ticket because they thought he was white. He had to tell the conductor that he was black because this was a staged protest, right? This was a staged protest of segregation. So he had to say, hey, I shouldn't be in this cart, right? I'm black. They're like, oh, you're black. This is how powerful this anti-black, this is how powerful the degradation associated with black blood is. So when there's intermixing between indigenous and black communities, that becomes a way to erase indigeneity and indigenous people. And we see it throughout New England. And we see Rhode Island start to say as early as 1831 that all of the Narragansetts look black. They don't look like Indians to me, right? They're saying the same thing. By the 1870s, there's a huge push to detribalize the Narragansett. And the reason why is because they're not Indian anymore. They have intermixed. Now, indigenous peoples don't just lay down and say, yeah, that's right, we're not Indian anymore, right? They challenge it. And there's this great quote from 1878 where there's this hearings about detribalization. And the government of the state of Rhode Island is saying, just do this. This is going to be good for you. You're going to become citizens. And they're like, we're going to be like black citizens because we see how you guys treat them. This is probably not a good idea, right? They actually say this, right? They're like, we see how we can be. They actually say we can be what? Ditch diggers, because that's what the black people do. Well, one of them gets up, and they didn't record his name in the paper. We believe it's a Hazard, though, which is one of the families of Narragansett. And he says, we are not Negroes, right? Because your ancestors stole the Negro from Africa and brought him amongst us and made a slave of him. We extended to him the hand of friendship and permitted his blood to be mingled with ours. Are we to be called Negroes and to be told that we may be made Negro citizens? I told you all the problems with that. We claim that while one drop, so they're switching this one drop rule and saying, no, it's not one drop of black blood, it's one drop of native blood, right? As long as one drop of Indian blood remains in our veins, we are entitled to the rights and privileges guaranteed by your ancestors to ours by solemn treaty, right? Saying that no, right? The way that you're defining indigeneity is not the way that we understand who we are as Indian people, as Native peoples. Still, right, these ideas are very strong and prevalent, and the quote from Tecumseh reveals over time this idea that this mythology of the vanishing Indian is very strong, right? And today, most Rhode Islanders believe that the indigenous peoples are gone. They don't exist, right? And because of that, we have episodes like this.
His developments now on the state's smoke shop raid this week. A lone Narragansett convicted in the case asked the Supreme Court to reverse his simple assault and disorderly conduct convictions. Our news partners at the Providence Journal reports Hathaway Brown argued a Superior Court judge did not hold a hearing into allegations 2 jurors showed racial bias. The state maintains the judge carefully assessed the allegations but found nothing.
I like that it stops on this picture because on the right, that's a Narragansett tribal officer. And on the left is a state trooper. And it shows the contestation here, right? This is on Narragansett ancestral tribal land. They are operating this smoke shop on their land. The state has no right to regulate traditional practices on indigenous land. Remember, the California case, right? The problem, though, is that the people that are amassed to stop the selling of these cigarettes on the Narragansett land don't really believe that the Narragansetts are authentic indigenous peoples. They don't really believe that the stipulations of that Supreme Court law apply to them because they don't look Indian to them, right? So this is the legacy of settler colonialism. This is the legacy of erasure, right? This is the issues that these communities are dealing with and wrestling with today. I just want to leave us with a couple of quotes here. Lloyd Wilcox, who was the medicine man, so that's what it is. This is what happened. This is racism, in your face racism, right? This made national news. It was like CNN, right? People saw this. And he said the face of Rhode Island racism is obvious now. And then Paula Dove Jennings, who was the Narragansett elder, said, this is what the state has done. They have taken away all of our rights and the casino, right? This is all part of this, right? This idea about who has rights, right? What does indigeneity mean? What does authenticity mean? What does sovereignty mean? Because the intermixing and interplay and the collapsing of identities in this region. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Mac. Thank you, Yuko. These are beautiful presentations, and they push us out to think, even like beyond my expectations at first. I truly appreciate your contributions here. Leonora is now offering her.
Sorry if you were like brothers and then you're like, hey, it has nothing to do with
It's same for mine.
No, I mean, this is challenging, but I'm so happy that I'm the first who has some words to say about this, but obviously the floor is open to anybody, so please just jump in whenever you feel like. So I'll start with you, Yuko, and then to Mark. And I was really interested in the way you talk about the obscured boundaries and gray zones in your chapter, and you talk about this in relation to legal and extra legal. And so I just wanted really to ask you if you can tell us a bit more about that, because I later in the paper you use Agamben. And so we're talking about categories here. We're talking about epistemologies, going back to our first panel this morning. And so I was thinking, is a gray zone or an obscure boundary a category itself? And is it a category of absence? So is absence, right, epistemologically important for us to redefine what we're trying to redefine? And I'll leave it there. And I'm sorry, I know it's a general and narrow question.
Do you want to ask too, or should I just, how do you want to do this?
How would you like to?
However you prefer. You may present all questions and the answer if you want to do.
Well, I can present all the questions now, and actually I have a second comment on your chapter, which was about the healable bodies. This very important concept, and just to try to steer this towards the direction of looking at the history of slavery from a global perspective. I was immediately thought of the Zong massacre when I read about the way you use this concept in your paper in reference to a different massacre. But I was thinking of the Zong, which happened in 1781, so later. But I mean, because that was a case that became a legal case, a huge one that exposed something that was ongoing since forever in the slave trade. So those were all killable bodies. Those that were part of the Zong were legally recognized as victims, as being murdered, being killed, but the previous ones, all the previous ones were not. So this legal case shed the light on also all the previous massacres. And so I was thinking, is this something that would you consider in a comparative view, these two
massacres and the legal cases they open up, or we can't compare them. And Mark, thank you so much to you as well for your presentation. I remember the other lecture you gave at the center, and especially I remember all that you told us about Roger Williams and this painting that represents him being welcomed by the Narragansetts, and that is what you were hinting at here, but saying this is exactly what is really embedded within the tradition. That is the open arms and welcoming attitude. And so I was really thinking in terms of representations while we were talking. Cinematic representation, but just let's keep it visual representations more in general. So you showed us this ironized Cody. So what do you think are the ways that the cinematic representations, visual representations could counteract all that history of representations in terms of the vanishing Indian stereotype that has been represented in many drawings, in many manifestos or flyers, in terms of this sort of, they don't look like Indian mythology. Is there a way this could be counteracted by new and different representations today, and how? And just one last comment, and then I leave the floor to you. I really want to mention the archive that was put together by Hebe Matos, Professor Hebe Matos, the University Federal Fluminense, and this is the documentary film Present Pasts, and you know it. And I think in terms of representations, in terms of absence, in terms of what can we do today in order to sort of give visibility and representability that flip the viewpoint on these histories, this is a very important resource. Yeah, that's it.
Okay. Thank you for the comments and questions. And once again, my apologies that I sort of veered from just the chapter, because I didn't want to dwell. I wanted to be like, I've done other things. I think. So about your questions about the obscure boundaries and gray areas, because this chapter was on the relationship between violence and legal regimes for Indigenous and Black people. And you said particularly about like, is that a category in some of these obscure categories? And I think very much so, and I think it also connects back to what Alina was saying about like the law in Colombia about citizenship. In terms of the chapter, I wanted to write against this idea that Indigenous massacre is happening because it's a frontier anarchy, right? Yeah. That there's no law because it's in the frontier and people are just doing whatever the hell they want. Like, that's like the easy way to say it, but if you look carefully, I was so struck that these examples of different Indigenous, these are called entradas, right? When these expeditions go in, they are so specific the way they take place. It almost sounds almost like a trope, but when you actually read the sources, the details and the vividness, I was like, no, I don't think this was made up. But in doing so, I just didn't, so looking at the carefulness of the violence itself, I was like, I don't think this was random. But also, if you make the argument that it was just frontier violence, I was like, no, because the people who are there, they make specific claims that this is legal, right? We have authorization from the police or from like, so they make claims that it's legal even when it's not, but then it goes through the legal system, right? So it's going through these legal channels in which what happens over time is that in the case that I studied from 1881, the perpetrators, there's mainly the white settlers, and then there's there's some indigenous guides. And then eventually, the indigenous guides were the accessories, but then they switched places, so now the indigenous people are considered like the main people. And then eventually, they're like, oh, nothing happened. Because there's no proof, right? No bodies were found, so hence no crimes took place. It's actually very much produced through the legal system. So I think that's very important to recognize that it's not a case of frontier anarchy, but it's actually carefully orchestrated. But in terms of absence, I think that's a really, to think about as a category. I think so in the sense that, kind of going back to my larger project and thinking about citizenship, right? The Brazilian Constitution, I guess like the Colombian Constitution, has no mention of race, right? It says everyone is a citizen, this is 1824. Everyone is a citizen of Brazil if you are born on the soil, right? So jus soli, right, the idea of natal rights. And if you are an immigrant who naturalizes. Oh, that sounds great. But, so what's not mentioned, right? So even though indigenous people are born on the Brazilian territory, they're implicitly, if you look at the debates beforehand, they're saying wild Indians, savage Indians, like the people I studied, are considered to not be part of Brazil because they are basically outside of society. That's the expression they use, right? And African people are also considered to be outside of society because they're just too different, right? So they're only really thinking about Brazilian-born Black people once they're manumitted. But none of this is actually mentioned. I had to only infer this from the debates that took place before the Constitution was written. And the very fact that slavery of indigenous people is recommenced before independence, continues afterwards, there's so much ambiguity. They're like, oh, they'll eventually become citizens, or even indigenous slavery is packaged as being, it's to civilize them, to prepare them for eventual citizenship. But there's no clear criteria by which, when do we know when they're civilized? Like it's not like you get a stamp one day and then you're suddenly a citizen. So the very ambiguity itself is kind of, I think, is dangerous, but I think it's intentional because it allows people to be kept in perpetual non-citizenship. So I think it's very intentional. And with Africans too, it's never mentioned, but in fact, to be naturalized, you have to have a nation or original citizenship. But because Brazil didn't recognize any African countries as nations, there's no nation from which you can naturalize, right? And also culturally, they were thought to be too foreign, so they couldn't become part of Brazil. None of that is actually mentioned, but in practice, that's what happened. So I think that what is not said and paying attention to it is really, really important. With the killable bodies, the comparison to the Zong is really interesting because, and I will confess, I'm not like an economic scholar. I was just looking at some other writings on violence and I came upon it. I was like, oh, that's interesting because I came upon it coming in from as a scholar of slavery, having read Vincent Brown and all these things about the law and about punishment of enslaved people and mastery and spectacle. And then I was like, oh wait, what about indigenous people? And like the absence of laws was so striking. But when I thought about the Botocudo Wars, the King Prince Regent literally said, I'm suspending all effects of humanity. He literally said, I'm suspending the laws so that you may all enslave them and kill them, right? So, and it's not like, and I think that state of exception basically continues. But it's so interesting that you compare it with the Zong, right? Where I think it was like an insurance issue, right? In the case of the Zong where they're thrown overboard and, but so I wanted to show you when you said that to me. So I'm studying legal slavery right now. I didn't share these images with you today, but here are some images from the, does it work? I'm sorry, I'm like so old school that does this work on my thing? Right. Sorry, I'm like super low tech, so that's why I print everything. Does it show? Yes, yeah, maybe?
That's it.
Darkness. Yeah. Oh, okay. So this is one of the things that I initially came upon. This is the ship I'm studying, Mary Smith. So left Boston 1855, goes to the River Congo, and then is captured off of Brazil, where I studied, Espírito Santo in 1856. And first I saw this in Arquivo Nacional in Rio, and I was like, oh my God, the list of the Africans who were rescued. Like, this is a story of abolition. It's so exciting. Like, I get their names. I can write their story. I can write the life stories of like some Amistad-like story, right? Of course, we give like everyone wants to write an Amistad-like triumphant story. So I was looking, and then they have these names, right? They get the registration number, Chito, Benegito, Abrão, and you see their ages, and some are very young. You can see 10, 15, 20, so they're mostly young men. And then I'm looking, and then here's right to whom they were attributed, because these were people who were liberated from illegal slavery. So this is supposed to be a list of like rescue, right, of anti-slavery. But then you look here and it says, Quando faleceram, when they died. And you look, everyone's dead, right, in observations. And you realize that if the ship was captured in January 20th, this is 3rd February 4th, it's like this hunting staccato, right? 5, 4, 5, 5, 5, 6, 6, 6, 6, 6. So they only survived maybe 15 days after they were rescued, right? So by the time they created this was created 8 months after. So they've been long dead. So what does it mean when we see a list that's supposed to be recording their liberation, their freedom, but they're already deceased, right? And even these names, right? People, it's like, we all know the transatlantic slave trade database, right? We have the data of the ships, and maybe some people create the database of names, and like I went to a whole conference about databases, and like it was a really weird conference, I have to say, because people were just like optimizing in these search terms, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, wait a second, can we look at the construction of knowledge itself? Like these names that often people just kind of plop into databases, they're made up. Like I also found the baptismal records, thanks to the Mormons, we don't keep all that record. They made up these names, and some of the people were baptized like after they were dead. So we don't even know what their real names were. And at best, what we have is this, the marks, the branding, right? But if you look closely, no braço esquerdo, né? Dentes perfeitos, perfect teeth, lábios grossos, think like. But sometimes you see, and I was like, this was so depressing for me to see. I was like, wait, I thought I could write about life, but this is just a record of death, right? End of commodification. But I'm still trying to look beyond it. So one of the questions I was looking beyond it was, in a way, yes, this is killable, right? They're literally deceased. This was a record of people who were liberated, but they're also a record of them as commodities, as merchandise, right? But if you look again, like, dentes perfeitos, because we don't have photographs, some of times sources have scarification drawn out. In this whole record, I only had one. But if you look closely, they see dentes limados. These are filed teeth. And I talked with a historian who works on Angola, and Daniel Domingues da Silva, and I was like, can I pinpoint like what these dental modifications mean? And he's like, it's actually too common that you're not gonna be able to actually do that. But I was like, maybe at least this is a hint about something before, right? And I know it's in a way it's a futile endeavor, but I feel like I still have to try. Because otherwise, right, once again going back to epistemologies, if I just use this date and I don't even question it, and I'd be like, Raphael was 18 when he was captured, then I'm just replicating and spewing back the logic of the archive, right? So in that sense, when you say killable, in a way they are, but I think that we have to do something beyond it. And hence, so I'm just, I wonder now, like everyone now is about data, and like I feel like a lot of public humanities is about data sets and databases, real data. But I feel like, how do you show these nuances and the problems, and the kind of the gaps, and like how can we capture these stories even in these sources that I, as an archivalist, trying to use. And just another final example is years ago when I was at the Schomburg, and I was a Schomburg fellow, I was just showing these images that I took, I do like the archives. But these are like, I just showed this picture, and one of the assistants there who's, she's an actor, and she just was like, wow, that's so beautiful, because she had never seen 19th century manuscripts. But these are all just lists of people who died, right? Marambaias, one of the famous slave ships captured, falecidos, right? Like all these are just lists of horrible deaths. Some people don't even have names, because they died, they were given a number, but before they could even be registered, right? So why are they creating these beautiful records of these people who just died horrible deaths? Right? So in a way, it's a performance of recording. Look, we are doing our duty to, apprehend these ships, and we want to record all the people that we tried to liberate, blah, blah. But it's also a story of death. So I'm still trying to figure out, like, even as it's so, the story of death is overwhelming, how we can write beyond it. And it's hard. I don't know if I have an answer yet, but it's something I'm thinking about. Sorry, that was super long.
All right, so you asked a question about representation, popular representation of Indigenous peoples, and how these can be challenged. So I'll use an example and relate it to today. In 1935, in Rhode Island, this was the tricentenary of Rhode Island, right? So there's this huge celebration, 300th year. Part of Rhode Island's history, like Leonora talked about, was this history of interaction between the indigenous peoples and the colonists who came, right? And how that history has been interpreted in a positive light. So at the tricentenary, there was an opportunity for indigenous peoples to be part of this because they were part of that history, right? So there was opportunities for them to play the roles, that historical role, these same groups that the contemporary Rhode Islanders said didn't exist, right? So the Narragansetts used that opportunity to play those historic roles, and they dressed as Canonicus and Mayantonomi, and they reenacted the coming of of Roger Williams to Rhode Island, right? And there was this whole pageant, and the last act of their pageant, they took off all of the garb, and they marched down, they had a parade, and in the parade, they announced everyone who came through. And one of the most famous people at this time that they had was this runner named Tarzan Brown. And they said, this is our runner. Not this is our historical runner, this is our runner now. You all know who he is because you've been celebrating his exploits. This is him. But this is our doctor, this is our teacher, this is our college graduates, right? This is our typical mother and father. This is our typical family. And they marched in their everyday clothes saying, this is what we look like now, right? This is us, right? Challenging those images and those ideas by embracing them, right? To be able to say, well, there's this other image of us too. You recognize us when we dress like this. Recognize us when we're dressed like this also. And then today, I see a lot of the same opportunity. There's a lot of movement and drive and wanting to respect indigenous peoples, indigenous culture, right? Continuance and survivance. This is where all the land acknowledgements and all of that stuff comes from, right? There's this moment in which this happens. And I see that lots of communities in the Northeast embrace being part of that, right? So Brown just went through a land acknowledgement exercise, and in that exercise, they asked the indigenous communities of this region to participate. And they didn't say, come and participate wearing regalia, right, and feathers. They said, come as you are. And so they're having this public face and this public moment where they're saying, well, this is what we are now. And traditionally, indigenous peoples, especially in this region, I don't want to say embrace, but they use kind of like that 1935 moment, the characterizations, expectations that people had about what they look like. So they did don the Western style headdresses, right? People here didn't wear those headdresses, but that's what others saw as authentically native. So they put them on, right? So yeah, this is us, right? This is who we are. We are native, right? This shows it. And now there's an opportunity, because there's this resurgence of interest in these communities, to take off those headdresses and say, yeah, this is who we are. And the example that I have is the Narragansett today, their chief, phenotype, he looks, you can tell that he has African ancestry. 30 years ago, that wouldn't have happened. He wouldn't have been the chief. But it's this reclamation of identity, right? And showing that this is authentically who we are. And we can be people that are descendant tribes and intermixed, and that doesn't negate who we are as indigenous peoples.
I wanted to present one question to each one of you. Of course, I'm taking advantage of your opportunity. Please, go for it.
Thank you.
First, you go. I really like your book, and I particularly love this chapter. I think it is brilliant. I think you're doing something here. You're opening a possibility for discussion that I think hasn't been developed yet in Brazil. So I
It's
think,
supposed to finally come out in Brazil at some point, so.
oh, yeah.
I don't know when, but it's.
But you're doing something here that if people take seriously your idea of thinking about different degrees of citizenship, different ways of thinking about race, and now about violence, I think there's an entire field to be explored here. And I think you are opening this field with this chapter.
Well, thank you. I was like, when can I retire? So thank you.
A wanted to, like, since the workshop is about racial violence, I wanted to push a little bit on this topic. Like, on like page number 136, you mentioned, you said this, but I'm gonna share with everyone, of course. Violence, therefore, did not signify state absence or frontier anarchy. You said that. Rather, it signaled the ways in which the state and local agents created uneven legal regimes of citizenship for indigenous and enslaved Brazilians during a critical moment in post-colonial Brazil history when Indian extinction and abolition had converged. So here, you're talking not only about violence, about race, but about different, like uneven legal regimes of citizenship. I can talk about like uneven degrees of citizenship. You can think about that. That's how I analyze this topic. So I wanted you to talk a little bit more about how you see this experience in with indigenous people, people of African descent, enslaved Africans or free people of color, how they are at the same time integrated and excluded from these uneven regimes of citizenship. And then how can we think about these different regimes of violence towards them? Because you're mentioning indigenous people as, since they are excluded or almost absolutely excluded from citizenship, it's as if they're not even part of social contract. They are in a permanent state of war. They can be terminated. But then African people who were enslaved, their descendants, they are in a different situation in this society. And of course, they suffer under a different regime of violence, but their children, the ones who are born in Brazil and many meet, they become citizens. The ones who are enslaved, they receive some kind of legal protection, although they're not citizens. So I wanted you to explore a little bit more about how would you classify these uneven regimes of citizenship to understand why they're submitted to different regimes of violence. Both of them are suffering under terrible regimes of violence, but they're different. And then a second question, like in this chapter, you analyze what you call, it was almost like a lynching experience when we talk about Serafim. For those who did not read, Serafim was an enslaved black man, and he had like consensual sex with the daughter of a very important family, the Farias, and she got pregnant. And then the family just, they kill him, but in secrecy. And it's like on page 160, you mentioned, like even Peter Beatty, who was also invited to be here, but he couldn't make it. He mentioned that ritualized lynching was not a prominent part of Brazil's cultural grammar of popular justice. But slave castration, which happened to him, was exactly this, a ritualized act of violence against black masculinity. This is absolutely true. But we are talking about the 1880s. This is precisely when racial lynching is becoming a huge phenomenon in North America. And by then, there are episodes of racial lynching in Brazil, in the countryside of Rio de Janeiro, especially. A little bit in Minas Gerais, a little bit in São Paulo. And this episode, like this family, they kidnapped Serafim, they castrated him and killed him, but in secrecy, they didn't turn this into a ritual.
Right.
I wanted us to think about this contrast, about the differences, because like I'm saying in my research, like planters, when they were the ones conducting extralegal violence, they usually did it on their plantation. There was some kind of strategy, not making it a public ritual and not allowing like mobs to participate on the whole thing. But this is my interpretation. I think here you're bringing also something else, that in the 1880s, the legal system is actually acknowledging the existence of people of African descendants. So there's some kind of legal protection, perhaps in Brazil, that does not exist or it's not efficient in the American South. This is just me thinking with you. I don't know if this would be the answer. So I'll just like if you could talk a little bit more about how you interpret this, and even Mike can join this discussion if he wants, like how can we understand that we're talking about the same years. There are episodes of racial lynching in Brazil, but there's something else here. Why does this not become, like we're talking about a black man accused of not necessarily rape, but even consensual sex between a black man and a white woman could be transformed into a rape accusation. Why is this, like, which is so similar to the myth of the black rapist in the US? why is the myth of the black rapist not so efficient in Brazil, or if not efficient enough to mobilize mobs? I have one possible answer, but I'm pushing all of you to think
The
about it.
question, what date, what year that happened, the Seraphim?
I think it's
1884.
And Mac, I have a different question to you. Like you mentioned, like I was like I took note like one drop rule a billion times in my paper while you were talking, like, and I was fascinated about understanding like the American racial regime is different, like from Latin American racial regimes, precisely because of the one drop rule, this clearly segregated regime between whiteness and blackness. I wanted you to talk a little bit about how indigenous people fit into this narrative about race in the United States. And in the end, you kind of did, but then you brought something interesting. Usually the one drop rule is used to classify someone as like, if you have one drop of African blood, that you're somehow inferior. And you're talking about cases in which people are claiming the one drop blood of indigenous people as a way to claiming like an indigenous identity as a positive thing and as a political act. I wondered if you could explore a little bit how you see indigenous people, the one drop rule, and the differences between how people of African descent and people of indigenous descent have handled this racial regime in the United States. I think these are big questions.
Wow. No, we continue with questions?
Okay, go ahead. Okay.
No, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
No, mine is actually nothing at all. So just, I couldn't first, it was a lot taken. So I couldn't about myself to ask how much it wouldn't the conditions of property have a very decisive, let's say, impact or determine both, I would say both, but more importantly in your case, the laws protect them, indigenous people and black people. So once we are property, probably both in both cases they were property, but also I think more importantly the weight of this property and the economy, in Brazilian economy in this case. And concerning some more contemporary cases here in the United States, I am really shocked. For me, it's more than a billion. It's compelling in the sense that the mestizaje, because what you are discussing is mestizaje, so the racial intermixing here in the United States, and the implications in the identification of these two groups. And first, I wonder if the understanding of identities as a creation, the shiftiness on those identities, because it is a creation by Donald Trump and his ancestors. So maybe Trump's ancestors decided what was indigenous at a certain moment, and it was wonderful the use of this particular event, that moment where he said, so they don't look Indians to me or indigenous to me. Mm-hmm. Why? Because he had an agenda, an economic agenda, was the same agenda of his ancestors, of the white people before, the European people before him. And parting from this economic agenda is that they decide who is black, indigenous, green, purple to decide. And so this is one thing. I wonder how it is, so how the other part, so the creation actually of these identities could play a role in those forms of identification and the fight of mestizaje, who is, so mestizaje, in racial intermixing, sorry, here in the States. So, because it's such a disruptive, it's another unexpected for them, not yes, unexpected consequences of colonialism and enslavement, which was racial intermixing. They were expecting yes, racial intermixing, but to increase the marginalized, but not as citizens. So what to do with this as citizens, with citizenship, with all this mass of Americans in general who are not properly, black or who are mixed. And this is a reality that they has been, so I not going to say they is the power, but it has been trying to minimize or to deal with since the beginning of our nations, and they cannot. So your example, what you're bringing here, because it's the same that has happened in Latin America, for instance, and this is why they come up with all the different variations of racial democracy throughout the Americas. And here now we have the same situation, to similar situation. They don't know what to do with the mixed race, and which is finally was probably the majority of the population, and then but they have to keep the identity, the rigid identities, and this is when these clash are arising. So I wonder if analyzing, this is my question actually, if analyzing those events more in a broader perspective, in the creation of identities and within actually a hemispherical or a comparative perspective wouldn't help now to, I am wondering if you have been doing this probably. Tell us. For me it would be great to know about it.
Maybe you can answer these questions and then we have a final round before you.
I'm sorry if I went, it was extremely
No.
Okay, now I have to revisit your question. But I was like, I think your question is about my whole book, so I'm just kidding. How are Indigenous and Black people integrated and excluded from citizenship, right? How can we think of different regimes of violence? So part one is that, of course, once again, I was coming from studying just from like Black diasporic lens, and then I was like, wait a second. I can't be doing this because these questions that are coming up are happening within Brazil, and it's also, right, literally, they're kind of, I saw the parallels and kind of the conversations happening with Indigenous, questions of Indigeneity, etc. And yet I also realized that I couldn't just put them in the same category, like because they're subaltern, their issues are exactly the same, right? And we could just put them together in like a top and then a bottom, like it wasn't that simple at all. So I was kind of trying to write against that idea. That said, the different regimes so the exclusion from citizenship, it happens legally, it happens from questions of culture, how much they are Brazilian and part of society or not, their capacity for civilization, those are kind of the discourses that come up. But the different regimes of violence, this is something that I still don't quite have an answer for, because this whole chapter, when I talked about Matar uma Aldeia, it's just so vicious, the idea that you just go in and kill everyone. It's like the Central American scorched earth campaigns, right? Like the 1980s, like it's terrible, right? And I'm not saying one form of violence is less horrible than the other. That's not what I want to say. But I still, like, at the end of the chapter, I was like sort of grappling, like, why does this happen? Like, you don't see people, well, I get to, of course, there's the transatlantic slave trade, which is horrific in itself, but people aren't going in and massacring Black people in Brazil, like in whole communities, right? And there was something so kind of viscerally, qualitatively different, and I don't know that I still have a clear answer yet. But I think part of it is this idea of Indigenous people as the like extinction discourse. Some people sort of hope that maybe eventually Black people also be integrated and disappear as a separate category. But this concerted effort to literally just this fantasy, right? Indigenous people are just going to disappear. They're no longer here. Like, why, right? They're so invested in saying that Indigenous people have disappeared. And I think that kind of was a way to justify and to kind of make sense of this kind of extravagant violence. Because I don't see a parallel discourse emerging regarding African descended people. And once again, words have power, right? And ideas have power, images have power. And I think that in this way, there's kind of a convergence between this horrific violence and what was being said about Indigenous people. The idea that indigenous people exist outside of society, I think, is even strong today still, right? They're still legally wards of the state. They're still not full citizens. The Statute of Indians still hasn't been officially dismantled. So they're literally not full citizens in the same way. But it's something that I still don't quite have an answer for. And I almost don't want, it's like when I'm like teaching about the Argentine military dictatorship, I'm like trying to tell my students, like, we need to understand the views of the torturers, but I was like, but I also don't want to, because you almost don't want to understand why people can be this horrific. So it's a struggle that I haven't quite resolved. If I may use the word castration, in ritualized violence, why the black rapist trope didn't emerge, to me it's interesting because it's not like it's not there. And I talk in another chapter about quilombolas, the leading quilombola, who's like a folk hero still even now in that part of the country. He is in fact accused of raping a child. And I don't think it happened, but it's happened because he's accused of leading an insurrection against slavery. That's when the rapist trope comes up, so it's there.
Yeah.
But in this particular sexual union case, it's not used. And I think it's partly because the witness, the female slave who was attending to this woman, so I was like, oh, I know what happened. Like, I washed her clothes, I know the traces. Like, she was sharing all these details. But also the fact that the woman was a widow, she wasn't a virgin, so she couldn't claim being deflowered. There's all these things. So I think maybe even from a legal point of view, there was a reason that they couldn't claim rape. But the hidden nature, that to me was the most striking because I always thought that, slave punishment is most effective when it's public, especially something like castration. And yet the fact that it's secrecy, maybe you answered my question, is that maybe in Brazil it was always more of a private matter, right? It wasn't a site of mob violence, and what did I write here? And I don't know, maybe in your question, kind of going to your question, like, is it because they were property? Like, I don't know. Did they? Because I think by this time there was, as I write, there was more public censure against indiscriminate violence against enslaved people, right? Like the emperor already outlawed capital punishment, and there was a lot of public opinion was turning against excessive punishment. By this time, slavery is being abolished individually in states. So I think there's public opinion is turning against it, and I think this family was aware of it, and they found it shameful too. I think the daughter was, I don't know how advanced her pregnancy was. They forced her to have an abortion, and her enslaved attendant who helped administer the abortion through herbs and through medicinal knowledge. She won her freedom in exchange for administering the abortion, and then they buried the fetus, and then the woman got sick because it was a forced, and then she had to be sent away. So she was erased too. She's disappeared also, right? So there's a lot that's done in secrecy, but yeah, it's partly because of the shame, and I think they were aware of the public censure. But I think that contrasts with the killing of indigenous people. The people who did it were like, what are you gonna do about it? And there's this brazenness to their behavior that is very different from the way that the masters, the Serafim's owners, dealt with it. And what's interesting is Serafim wasn't secret about it at all. He was like telling everyone. He's like, yo, I'm having sex with her. Yeah, and he was like not hiding it. And I think that also became a problem. So, but sorry, I don't have a lot of clear answers. But anyways.
So sorry if I don't remember all the aspects of the questions at this point. But I believe that Marcelo, what you were asking about is how do Black and Indigenous peoples interact differently with this one drop concept? So I think that the major difference is that Indigenous peoples have primacy rights to this place, right? So there's a benefit to having Indigenous heritage. In theory, right? It doesn't have to work out that way a lot of times, but in theory, there is. And people of African descent do not, right? Maybe one day when there are reparations that might change, but right now, there's no primacy rights, there's no reclamation, right, movement. There's nothing to, benefit people of African descent in this nation, that their heritage is a boom for them. There's no example of this. So what I see in relation to that question is indigenous peoples claim to their indigeneity as their primacy rights, their right to be at this place, their right to claim ownership of this land, their right to have access to this cranberry bog, or this fishing spot, right, or these traditional things that were part of it, right? We see that in the California case. This is traditional part of our heritage. This is our primacy rights. And then in African peoples, in some people of African descent, you see the opposite, right? Not Plessy, right? But some who can pass, because that's where the advantage is, right? So you don't have the same motivation to claim that identity, extrinsically, right? And then I might not have exactly the answer for this question. I think you were asking about the creation of identities in a more broad sense.
Yeah, somehow. Well, it's late. We're all tired. Yeah, somehow. Yes, it's more. Yeah. So if it would be possible to interrogate, to question actually not who looks how it looks, but the fact that somebody does have. So the fact of those processes of creating these forms of identification, any forms of identification. So finally, what is to be, so is really what is to be an Indian is really a way of defining it, or has it never been something? So in Indian, Indigenous, not anywhere, or black, etc. Or if it is finally a creation, not from that. So we will never, nobody will never look like an Indian, because it doesn't exist, that look. You show it there. So there is this actor that is Italian and who was Italian and could be was considered like an Indian. So yeah, it's actually at the very ultimately it's a question of identifications of who define what is to be. So neither, so this is one part of this was, and the other one is broadening, but in the sense of probably relating the ideas of mestizaje, or racial intermixing, with similar situations. So it's a complicated, and it's a complication reflection at this stage. So I just wanted to hear your thoughts about something.
So I'm not sure if it's exactly, but when I heard the question, this is what I was thinking of. So that ethnogenesis that I talked about, right, with the people moving in between communities. My favorite example is this person called named Uncas. And if you don't know who Uncas is, he's the character from, he's a real person, but the Last of the Mohegans book and movie is based on him, right? Uncas is Mohegan, Last of the Mohegans, right? But obviously the Mohegans aren't last. They have a casino right next to Foxwoods, right? But they're still here. But Uncas at points was Mohegan, Pequot, and Narragansett, right? These are the three major communities in this region. All of those he was. So this speaks to the ability of people to move between communities, and that this identity is not, based on where you're born, right? It's not. Right? People can be integrated into these communities. There's another story, right when King Philip's War, what's known today as King Philip's War, is breaking out. Roger Williams meets with a group of Narragansetts, and they ask him, they say, hey, how come you all aren't allowing Philip, right, or the Wampanoag, and Plymouth to fight it out between them two? How come all of you are jumping on the side of Plymouth? They don't understand why they're doing this. And Roger Williams says, it's because we're all English. We're all white, right? We all support each other. And this is like revelation for them because they, to that point, believe Roger Williams was one of them. But he's making this separation and saying, no, I'm not one of you, I'm one of them. So this idea of identity, right, is something new to the people in this community. And what is happening is, and there's this great book, First Thing and Last Thing by Jean O'Brien, where she talks about this process. First is this separation. Well, you see with Roger Williams saying that, right? This separation, this way, this talking about indigenous communities as barbarians, as barbaric, and talk about, you know, all of the heathens and detriment, all of the things that separate uncivilized, right? Nature, natural, right? Bestiality, whatever it is, right? All of those things that separate the civilized colonists from them, they're separating themselves. It's all about this crisis of identity for the colonists, right? Because they're not English anymore, especially after the revolution, right? So now what are they? Well, enough of the indigenous population has been exterminated through genocidal practices that they can become the primacy people of this land, that they can now become native to America because the Native Americans are gone. And they start to take on this identity of Native American, right? They're gonna be Native, and you can see that, I mean, even today in the Boy Scouts, right? And in the ways that we celebrate, and the fascination with indigenous culture, indigenous lifeways, right? So this identity crisis is part and parcel to, you know, the creation of America.
Can I add can I add to your comment, kind of connecting? About your was about mestizaje, like, I feel like like race mixture happens obviously in Brazil too, but it's not equal. Like I remember, like even in my own work, like race mixture becomes a way to disappear indigenous people, right? In the same way that Trump was implying, right? You're not really, I don't see you as Indian. But like that was like the national policy, but if they were kind of, so the discourse was often was, oh, but the indigenous people are mixed up in general society, so they're no longer Indian, whether it be cultural or whether it be racial. But kind of whitening was a good way of mestizaje, like mixture. But there's cases where they're like, oh, but they're not really indigenous because they're curibocas and cabras, and these are racial categories that are actually imply black indigenous mixture. So in that way, they're like, oh, they're depraved, they're thieves, they're disgusting. So it's also these like attributes are given to them, right? When it's a mixture of black indigenous, but it's still used as a way to say there's no more indigenous people. And then the subsequent thing was there's no more indigenous people, so we can take that land. So it's always tied to land. But so race mixture kind of happens in different ways, but the ultimate purpose is the same, is kind of basically taking their land. But as a separate thing, I was just thinking about Jan French, who's a legal anthropologist, wrote this really wonderful book, Legalizing Identities, in which she studies, this is more recent, 2 communities in northeast Brazil, Sergipe. Both communities were related to each other. They were both black indigenous mixed communities, but they took different legal strategies. One group decided to claim identity as indigenous, and the other group decided to claim legal identity as quilombola. So in Brazil, quilombola no longer means maroon. It's a separate legal category about an African descended community since or maybe from the time of slavery who maintains African cultural practices, right? And it's a certain legal category claim that also comes with land recognition. So even though ethnically the mestizaje is the same, you can take different legal strategies to claim different legal identities. So I thought kind of making that connection, that was interesting to think about economic and other rights that maybe you can claim, even though your racial ancestry might be the same.
Great. Does anyone have a final question you want to present? I think Aline has something.
Just a comment, but
Please.
if everybody is tired, I won't. No, I was just, you guys really like very much your book. And it makes me think a lot about the rest of South America as well, especially Colombia, of course. And there, with independence, the Constitution is very clear. The Constitution is about free people. So racial distinction disappeared. But neither the enslaved people nor the indigenous people are in any place in the constitution. They are out of the nation. And then shortly after, a few weeks, the Congress then has special law, one law that is called manumission law, which in fact is about keeping slavery, and the other is about indigenous people. And indigenous people are categorized in the two categories, salvajes, but it's the term that is used, and civilized Indians who have been brought into the nation through Catholicism. So these are specific ones. And then what is quite extraordinary, we don't know much about what happens throughout the 19th century. And I think there is a lot of research that should be done in Colombia. And at the end of the 19th century is when the Colombian state contracts Catholic mission to civilize and evangelize Indian communities. And the whole country, the whole map is divided into vicariato, you probably know that, but and the last ones to be really drawn on the map and attributed to special missions is in 1950s.
Wow.
It continues on. And then these indigenous people are entrusted to these Catholic congregations who civilize them through labor.
Right.
Forced labor and orphanage for children and so on. So I think it would be nice for you to sort of meet with some people who work on the rest of South America to sort of, because what you say about the mid-19th century is not researched elsewhere. And I'm pretty sure that the cases of enslavement exist as well. I'm pretty sure.
Thank you.
So anyway.
So I think this is the end of our final panel today. I know it was a long day. I tried to organize the panel with like 2 speakers per panel. I think it's like not that much, but still, I think we had a long conversation today, and I truly appreciate the opportunity of learning so much from you, sharing this room with you. I know it was a partial distribution for too long, I apologize. And I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. I just would like to remind you that in a few minutes we have dinner available to everyone around here. Once again, you can use the entire campus if you want to.
What is a few minutes?
Anything.
What is a few minutes, just to see if I have time to go outside?
Dinner would begin in like 20 minutes or something.
Okay, so I can go.
You can take. Yes, we're going to reach the shadow so that you can get back to you. So thank you so much.
See you, sir.